6 weeks after D-Day, the Allied armies were still stuck. Not retreating, not losing, but stuck. Fighting field by field through the Norman bocage, that dense patchwork of sunken lanes and high earthen hedgerows that swallowed armour and cancelled every advantage American doctrine had been built around. A Sherman tank trying to push through a bocage wall either bogged in the embankment or exposed its thin belly armour climbing over it. A rifle platoon moving along a sunken lane between two hedgerows was essentially moving through a trench that the defenders had chosen and prepared. By mid-July 1944, 7 weeks of fighting had produced gains measured in single-digit miles per week, and the American command understood that if something did not fracture the German line soon, the campaign risked settling into exactly the kind of grinding attritional war that the Normandy plan had been designed to avoid. What General Omar Bradley proposed was to stop trying to outfight the bocage and simply erase the German defenders holding the key point at Saint-Lô. The plan called for approximately 2,500 Allied aircraft, heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers, to carpet a rectangle of ground roughly 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep just south of the Saint-Lô road on the 25th of July 1944. Dropping an estimated 4,000 tons of bombs onto the German Panzer-Lehr-Division and the infantry units behind it. Then, within minutes of the bombing stopping, American armour would push through whatever remained of the German line before it could recover and reconsolidate. The concept had a brutal internal logic. The execution nearly broke it before it began. The day before the main raid, July 24th, aircraft accidentally dropped bombs short of the target boundary, falling on men of the American 30th Infantry Division and killing 25 soldiers. The operation was halted and rescheduled. When the full raid went ahead on July 25th, short bomb drops happened again. The 30th Division was hit a second time. In total, American bombs killed 111 US soldiers and wounded nearly 500 more across both days. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, who had moved forward to observe the operation and was caught in a bomb pattern that had drifted from its intended corridor. He was found buried under rubble, his body identifiable only by the 3 stars on his collar. And yet, the bombing worked on the German side, in a way that even Bradley had not fully anticipated. The Panzer-Lehr-Division, which had entered Normandy at roughly full strength in June, was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, reported that roughly 70% of his men were dead, wounded, or so severely concussed by the blast pressure that they could not function. Vehicles had been thrown off roads. Gun positions had collapsed inward. The survivors who tried to hold the line, when American armour rolled south through the corridor, found themselves fighting without artillery support, without communications, and in some cases, without the ability to locate their own units. The German line did not just bend, it fractured in a way that no amount of tactical repositioning could repair in the hours available. The name most associated with what followed is George Patton, and that is both accurate and slightly misleading, because what Patton's Third Army did after August the 1st, when it was formally activated at Avranches and began pouring through the gap that Cobra had torn open, was build on a breach that Bradley and the First Army had already ripped through German defences at significant cost. What Patton added was speed. By the 15th of August, less than 2 weeks after activation, the Third Army had advanced nearly 400 miles from Avranches, racing southeast across the base of the Brittany Peninsula, and then swinging east toward the Seine. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, trying to recalibrate their defensive lines against a force moving faster than their orders could travel, were already being overtaken before they could establish new positions. There is a particular moment I keep coming back to when I read through the Third Army's daily fuel returns from that August. The numbers tell a story that the tactical maps cannot fully show. On a single day in mid-August, the Third Army drew roughly 400,000 gallons of petrol from supply dumps that were themselves struggling to keep pace with the advance. The Red Ball Express convoy system, running around the clock on one-way road circuits from Normandy's beaches, was moving hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition daily just to keep the armoured columns from stalling. The Breakout was not just a military achievement, it was a logistics race run at the absolute edge of what the Allied supply chain could sustain, and it held together by the narrowest of margins. If the night has settled in and you are already somewhere between waking and sleep, let the summer of 1944 carry you the rest of the way. The carpet bombers droning south over the Norman fields, the dust rising where Panzer-Lehr had been, the columns of Sherman tanks pouring through Avranches in the August heat, crews sitting in hatches with maps they were already past. The whole arc, from the first bomber turning onto its run over Saint-Lô to the last armoured column crossing the Seine, is what this documentary traces. This is the entire history of Operation Cobra, Patton's breakout from Normandy. It is 50 miles of hedgerow country between the Normandy beaches and open ground. 50 miles. That's the distance from central London to the edge of the Chiltern Hills. Not a single tank could roll through it at speed. Not one. When Omar Bradley's First Army came ashore in June of 1944 and began pushing inland, his commanders were encountering terrain that their maps described as agricultural enclosure, a phrase so bloodlessly administrative that it almost obscures the fact that those enclosures were about to kill thousands of men. The bocage, that's the French word for it. Wooded country, hedgerow country, fields surrounded by earthen banks as old as the Norman conquest, matted through with tree roots and bramble, averaging somewhere between 3 and 12 feet high, and 1 to 4 feet thick at the base. Not fences, not hedges in the English garden sense. Walls, organic walls, packed solid, rooted into the Norman clay over centuries of farming. Here's what a Sherman tank does when it hits a bocage bank straight on. The nose pitches upward. The tank rides up the embankment like it's going over a ramp, and for a moment, it's almost vertical. And in that moment, the belly armor is exposed to anything on the other side. The belly is the thinnest plate on the vehicle. German anti-tank crews knew this. They waited. The Americans learned the hard way, one field at a time, one tank at a time, one afternoon at a time. It wasn't a strategic failure. It wasn't an intelligence failure. The hedgerows simply were not in anybody's pre-war tactical manual, because nobody had fought a mechanized war through Norman farmland before. And the planners back in England had looked at aerial photographs and seen green squares, and assumed those green squares were passable. They weren't. The stalemate that developed in the weeks after D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, has been discussed endlessly in terms of German resistance, and German resistance was real and fierce. But the bocage is the part of the story that doesn't get enough attention, and I think that's partly because it resists the kind of dramatic telling that fits a documentary. You can't make a single scene out of 40 days of men dying in small fields. By the time Operation Cobra was being planned in early July, Bradley's First Army had taken roughly 100,000 casualties since the landings, a number confirmed by the NDU press analysis of the campaign, citing specifically 9,939 dead and wounded in the 29th Infantry Division alone, and 7,876 in the 4th Infantry. Those aren't totals for the campaign. Those are single divisions. The bocage was doing that to them, field by field, bank by bank. The German situation on the other side of those banks was not what the Americans assumed it was. The Wehrmacht in Normandy was not a fresh, well-supplied force holding a clean defensive line. By early July, the Germans had been fighting continuously since the 6th of June. they were short of ammunition. The Luftwaffe had been effectively driven from the sky by Allied air superiority. Road and rail interdiction, the sustained Allied bombing of bridges, junctions, and supply routes behind the German lines, had reduced the flow of replacements to a trickle. The German 7th Army was burning through divisions the way a fire burns through paper, and it was receiving almost nothing in return. But the bocage made it possible for a depleted, under-equipped force to hold ground against a vastly larger, better supplied attacker. One machine gun crew behind one earthen bank could stop a platoon, sometimes a company. The arithmetic of the bocage worked in the defenders' favour at almost every scale. Bradley understood this by the second week of July. He had to break out, not just tactically, but politically. The Allied High Command was under pressure from Washington and London. The timetable for the campaign had assumed a much faster advance. The supply dumps building up behind the front were enormous. 2 million men and 250,000 vehicles were ashore in Normandy by late July, and all of them were competing for space in a beachhead that hadn't expanded nearly fast enough. If something didn't change, the whole logistical architecture of the campaign would begin to collapse under its own weight. It was in this context, not triumph, not momentum, but grinding stalemate and creeping administrative crisis, that the idea for Operation Cobra was born. Bradley had conceived the outline by the 11th of July. 2 days later, it had become First Army's plan. The name, whatever its origins, fit. Something that needed to strike fast and get out into open ground. The plan called for saturation bombing of a rectangular area approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep, the entire front of the initial attack. This was the zone held by the German Panzer-Lehr-Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armoured formations. After the bombing, 2 armoured divisions would punch through whatever was left of the German line and exploit into open country to the south. It sounded, on paper, clean and decisive. The planning conference at Allied Expeditionary Air Force headquarters on the 19th of July would reveal just how unclean it was going to get. Bradley flew to England himself to present the plan to Tedder, Lee-Mallory, and Sparts. He came home with a commitment for 1,500 heavy bombers, nearly 900 medium bombers, and 350 fighter bombers. He also came home with a misunderstanding that would, 6 days later, kill more than 100 of his own soldiers. What Bradley believed he had agreed was a bombing run parallel to the front line, flying east to west along the German lines, so that any bomb errors would fall into German-held territory rather than onto American troops. What the 8th Air Force heard, or what it decided, depending on which account you read, was a perpendicular approach, flying north to south across the front, which put the bombers directly over American positions on their way to the target. The parallel approach was safer for the ground troops. The perpendicular approach was faster for the bombers, shorter exposure to German flak, more aircraft through the target box per minute. The air commanders preferred perpendicular. Bradley, according to his own memoir, explicitly wanted parallel. The written record of what was actually agreed at that meeting is, to put it politely, ambiguous. And that ambiguity was going to matter enormously. The bocage itself didn't disappear when Cobra was launched. That's the part the standard narrative often skips over. The carpet bombing was designed to create a gap through which the armour could exploit into open country. But the bombers were striking a zone south of the front line, and the American infantry still had to cross the surviving bocage between their start positions and the bomb line before they could exploit anything. Which is why, sometime in mid-July, in an orchard near Saint-Jean-de-Day, an American sergeant from the 2nd Armoured Division began welding steel prongs cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of a tank. His name was Curtis Cullen. The device became known as the rhinoceros, or the rhino, a set of heavy steel tusks that could ram into the base of a hedgerow bank and punch through it without pitching the tank's nose skyward. Between the 15th of July and the 25th, First Army's ordnance sections manufactured more than 500 of these devices. By the time Cobra began, roughly 60% of the tanks in the initial assault were fitted with rhino cutters. The other 40% were not. I want to dwell on the Cullen story for a moment, because it gets told in a particular way that turns it into a legend, and in doing so, quietly distorts it. The standard account credits Cullen with the invention, and by extension attributes much of Cobra's success to his ingenuity. Stephen Zaloga, who literally wrote the Osprey campaign book on Cobra, has examined this more carefully than almost anyone else. And what Zaloga found is that Cullen's rhinoceros was one of several parallel solutions being developed simultaneously. The tank crews of the 747th Tank Battalion had been experimenting with timber prongs called salad forks since late June. Lieutenant Charles Green of the same unit had designed a more durable version made of railroad track, the Green Dozer. The 3rd Armoured Division built their own variant, the Douglas Cutter, under a warrant officer who had been a professional welder before the war. Nobody had a complete picture of all these experiments happening simultaneously. What Cullen had was slightly better timing. Bradley happened to visit the 2nd Armoured Division on the 14th of July and was more impressed by Cullen's version than by the earlier salad fork demonstration. Bradley ordered mass production. Cullen got the credit. The others became footnotes. That's how military innovation often actually works. Not one eureka moment, but a field of parallel solutions, with recognition going to whoever a senior officer happened to see first. Whether the rhinos were decisive is a different question entirely. The evidence is mixed. Some units found them transformative on the 25th of July. Others found that the pre-attack bombardment had churned the pastures so thoroughly that tanks couldn't build up enough speed to breach the hedgerows with the prongs anyway. The 2nd Armoured Division, which had more rhinos fitted than almost any other unit and had helped pioneer the device, barely used them during Cobra's opening phase, because the Panzer-Lehr-Division facing them had been so shattered by the bombing that the armour advanced largely down roads rather than cross-country. It's a strange irony. The device invented to solve the bocage problem was rendered largely unnecessary in the sector where the bombing had solved it first. But in the sectors where the bombing hadn't solved it, where German resistance survived the air attack and American infantry still had to cross those banks on foot, the rhinos made a real difference. Military reality is like that. Solutions and problems don't line up neatly. Chapter 2. Start with what the map looked like from above. From an aircraft at 20,000 feet on the morning of the 19th of July, 1944, the Allied position in Normandy looked like a bite taken out of the French coast. A rough crescent of beachhead, widest in the east around Caen, narrower and more compressed in the west around the American sector. South of that crescent, more Norman farmland, more bocage, more hedgerows, more fields barely distinguishable from the air from the ones already soaked in blood. The planned attack box for Operation Cobra was approximately 7 miles west of Saint-Lô, marked on Allied maps as a rectangle roughly 4 miles long. From 20,000 feet, that rectangle was invisible. It was just more green. The men who planned the bombing in England were working from aerial photographs and grid references. The men who were going to carry it out were flying enormous, ungainly strategic bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, designed to strike industrial targets deep inside Germany, not to deliver precise support to infantry 600 yards away. The 8th Air Force had spent 3 years developing doctrine, training procedures, and operational routines for a very specific kind of mission: high-altitude precision bombing of fixed, well-charted targets. A ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt. A synthetic oil plant at Ploesti. Those missions had their own terrible costs and their own appalling inaccuracies. But they were at least missions the 8th Air Force understood how to plan. Carpet bombing in tactical support of a ground assault was something different. At the planning meeting on the 19th of July, one senior airman noted in his account of the conference that nobody in the room really knew much about carpet bombing. That quote appears in Sullivan's analysis in Parameters magazine, citing the meeting records. Nobody knew. They were all inventing it as they went. Bradley, sitting in that room, believed he was getting what he asked for. He'd been specific: a parallel bombing run, east to west along the German front, so that any bombs falling short would land in German territory rather than on his troops. The safety zone between the American front line and the bomb line was reduced from the airman's initial request of 3,000 yards down to 1,200 yards. A compromise that satisfied nobody and that Bradley only accepted because he needed the bombing close enough to the German front to capitalize on the shock. 1,200 yards. That's roughly a kilometer. The distance you can walk in about 12 minutes. The distance a man can throw a sound across on a clear day. For a bomb falling from 20,000 feet, it's almost nothing. What the 8th Air Force actually planned, and what Bradley, apparently, did not fully understand they had planned, was a perpendicular approach. North to south, flying directly over the American positions to reach the German lines. The reasoning was operationally sound from an Air Force perspective. A perpendicular run put each bomber over the target for the minimum possible time, reduced exposure to flak, and saturated the target box with more bombs in less time. But it also meant that if any crew released early, if any bomb site malfunctioned, if any formation drifted in turbulence, if any aircraft was thrown off course by flak, those bombs fell directly onto American troops rather than into open fields. The parallel approach had the opposite geometry. A short bomb fell into German territory, not Allied. Bradley understood this. He said so explicitly. And yet, the Air Force planned the perpendicular approach anyway, and the written record of the planning conference, such as it is, shows that someone at that meeting either failed to communicate Bradley's requirement or actively decided to disregard it. On the 24th of July, the bombers came, and almost immediately, things went wrong. The weather over the target area was worse than forecast. A 5,000-foot ceiling of cloud and haze that made visual identification of the bomb line difficult. Lee Mallory, who had flown to Normandy to observe, ordered the mission cancelled. But the cancellation order had to travel from Normandy back to 8th Air Force headquarters in England by radio, then back out to the approaching bomber formations. The delay was catastrophic. 352 heavy bombers had already released their loads before the recall reached them. Some of those loads fell short. The American 30th Infantry Division took 25 killed and 131 wounded from their own aircraft. Men struck in their positions before a single German had been engaged. And to compound the injury, American troops had pulled back from the front line in preparation for the bombing, ceding ground to the Germans that now had to be retaken at cost. The element of surprise had evaporated. Von Kluge, the German commander, reportedly wondered whether the July 24th strike had been a feint. There is something almost administratively absurd about how the chain of communication failed on that day. Lee Mallory was physically at Bradley's headquarters. He could look out of a window at the sky and see that conditions were wrong. But to cancel the aircraft already airborne, his order had to route back through England. It couldn't go direct to the planes. The radio architecture of the Allied Air Force in the summer of 1944 did not allow the ground commander at the front to speak to the bomber formations overhead. That single technical fact, a gap in communications infrastructure, contributed directly to 25 American deaths and a botched operational start. I find that particular kind of failure more interesting than the ones that get remembered, because it wasn't a failure of courage or planning or intelligence. It was a failure of wiring, of radio spectrum allocation, of a procedural assumption that nobody had thought to challenge before it mattered. The following morning, the 25th of July, They tried again. The conditions were better. The bombers came in 3 waves. First, the fighter bombers, striking a 250-yard strip directly along the German front line. Then the medium bombers. Then 1,503 of the 1,581 available heavy bombers, dropping their loads on the Panzer-Lehr-Division's positions. The total bomb tonnage delivered was more than 4,100 tons. More than 4,000 tons. Concentrated onto a rectangle roughly 7,000 yards by 2,500 yards. The ground below was transformed. Fritz Bayerlein, the Panzer-Lehr commander, described it afterward in his post-war interrogation. It was hell. The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt, and the bomb carpets came down. My front lines looked like a landscape of the moon, and at least 70% of my personnel were out of action. Dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. That quote has been reproduced in almost every account of Operation Cobra. It belongs there. It's one of the few pieces of first-hand testimony that captures what 4,000 tons of explosives actually does to human beings and the ground they're standing on. The bombing worked. Bayerlein admitted that it did, even as he also acknowledged that his division had not been entirely destroyed. In post-war analysis, he estimated roughly 50% losses to bombing, 30% to artillery, 20% to other weapons. Some elements of Panzer-Lehr survived the attack in fighting condition. The standard narrative of Cobra frequently overstates how complete the destruction was, because the ground attack on the 25th, the day of the bombing itself, actually stalled. Collins's 7th Corps hit fierce artillery fire from surviving German positions and couldn't break through. It wasn't until the morning of the 26th that the breakthrough actually happened. That one-day gap matters. It means Cobra's success was not the automatic mechanical consequence of the bombing, but of Collins's decision that evening to continue pressing forward rather than consolidate. A decision made on imperfect information, in the chaos of a day that had started with the bombing of his own troops. Because the friendly fire happened again on the 25th. After everything, after the cancellation, the casualties, the loss of surprise on the 24th, the bombers again flew perpendicular to the front, and bombs again fell short. Across the 2 days combined, 111 Americans were killed by their own aircraft, and 490 were wounded. Additionally, the blast and concussion effects produced 164 confirmed post-traumatic shock cases in the 30th Division alone. Men rendered temporarily non-functional, not by wounds, but by the sheer physical force of that many explosions happening around them. Those numbers sit in the after-action reports. They don't usually appear in the same paragraph as the breakthrough, but they belong there because they are part of the same operation, the same chain of decisions, the same day. I've spent time with the question of who bears responsibility for the short bombs, and it's genuinely difficult to answer cleanly. Bradley's memoir blames the Air Force for duplicity, claiming they told him the run would be parallel and then flew perpendicular anyway. The Air Force's own investigation pointed to specific units and specific mechanical failures. The AEAF planning documents suggest that Bradley's requirements were understood but overridden on operational grounds. Sparts, in his diary entry from mid-June 1944, wrote that the ground commanders simply needed sufficient guts and implied that the bombing plan's risks were being overstated. These are contemporaneous documents expressing genuine disagreement between people who all knew what was at stake. The truth is probably that there was no single act of bad faith, but rather a compounding of institutional assumptions, communication failures, and professional arrogance on multiple sides, and that 111 American soldiers died in the intersection of all of it. Chapter 3. Let me give you a number. 11,000. That's the casualty count Bradley's troops absorbed in the 5 days it took to capture Saint-Lô, ending on the 18th of July, 1944. 11,000 men, for a provincial French crossroads town that most Americans had never heard of before the war. The 29th Infantry Division and the 35th Infantry Division drove into Saint-Lô through hedgerow country that had already been contested for weeks. The town itself had been bombed heavily by Allied aircraft in the preceding days, not to support the ground assault, but as an interdiction target to destroy German supply routes. By the time the infantry entered, Saint-Lô was rubble. The cathedral was gutted. The medieval town centre had essentially ceased to exist. A French journalist who entered with the first Allied troops described the streets as a valley of ash. The Americans captured a wasteland and called it a victory. It was a victory. It cost 11,000 men. 11,000 in 5 days is a rate that requires a moment of arithmetic to absorb properly. That's roughly 2,200 casualties per day, which works out, given that the attacking force was primarily infantry, to a level of attrition that would empty a standard infantry regiment of its effective strength in under 2 weeks of sustained fighting. American divisions in Normandy were replacing their riflemen faster than the replacements could be trained. The standard procedure was to send men into the line within hours of arrival in the theatre, before they had oriented themselves, before they had been integrated into their units, before anyone around them knew their names. Replacements died at a rate disproportionate to their numbers because they made the mistakes that experience prevents, and in the bocage, there was no time to learn from mistakes. The First Army's medical system was absorbing casualties at a rate that several internal logistics reviews acknowledged as beyond planned capacity. The medical supply chain, morphine syrettes, plasma, surgical consumables, was running ahead of resupply projections. These aren't dramatic facts, they're bureaucratic facts. They describe a system under sustained pressure that the official casualty counts don't fully convey. Saint-Lô was the geographical key to the Cobra plan. The main road west of the town, the Periers-Saint-Lô road, was the natural boundary that Bradley wanted to use as his bond line's reference. Visually distinctive from the air, straight enough to be identifiable, it divided the Allied front from the German lines with enough clarity that, in theory, a bombardier at altitude could use it as an orientation point. The choice of that road as the bombing reference line was not arbitrary. It was the product of weeks of discussion about how to translate the chaos of the bocage front into something a strategic bomber crew, flying at 20,000 feet, could actually see and use. The bocage made everything below look like the same impenetrable green. The road was the one landmark that was consistently visible. The German forces holding the line south of that road, and specifically in the rectangular bombing box that would become Cobra's target, were anchored around the Panzer-Lehr-Division. Panzer-Lehr was not a typical Wehrmacht unit. It had been formed in 1943 from demonstration and training battalion cadres, the men who taught other soldiers how to operate armour. They were, in the sardonic phrase sometimes used in German regimental histories, the army's schoolmasters, and they fought like it. By July of 1944, Panzer-Lehr had already been through sustained combat at Caen, and its strength was well below its establishment. But it was still a formidable force, one of the better quality German formations in Normandy, holding a critical portion of the front with a combination of professional skill and the natural advantages of the terrain. It wasn't just Panzer-Lehr in the bombing box. German defensive doctrine called for layered defense in depth, with positions that absorbed the initial shock of an attack and then counterattacked into its flanks. There were additional units, infantry and support elements, distributed through the zone that Cobra's planners had identified. Some of those positions were well mapped by Allied intelligence. Others were not. American photo reconnaissance aircraft had been flying over the area for weeks, and the imagery they produced was good. But bocage is almost as difficult to read in aerial photographs as it is to navigate on the ground. A machine gun in a hedgerow bank is essentially invisible from above. The intelligence picture was imperfect, and everyone in the planning process knew it. Bradley's First Army had been trying to break through this position, or positions like it, since early July. Operation Cobra was, as the Warfare History Network's overview notes, Bradley's third breakout attempt. The first, begun on the 3rd of July, had been stopped by German infantry along the Douvre River floodline. The second had succeeded in taking Saint-Lô, but at the 11,000 casualty cost already described, and it hadn't produced the exploitation that the situation demanded. By the time Cobra was being finalized, Bradley and his staff were not optimistic visionaries planning a triumphant breakout. They were exhausted planners trying to solve a problem that had resisted every previous solution. That context matters for understanding the decisions that followed, including the decision to accept the risks of the carpet bombing, including the compromises on safety distances, including the willingness to absorb the possibility of friendly fire casualties in exchange for the chance of breaking through. The morning of the 25th of July began early, as military mornings tend to. The American infantry had been pulled back from the front line the previous evening to create the safety buffer from the bomb line. Then the bombers came. 600 fighter bombers first, in the assault wave, attacking the 250-yard strip directly adjacent to the German forward positions. Then the medium bombers. Then, in waves that Bayerlein would later describe as arriving like a conveyor belt, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, 1,503 aircraft, each carrying a load of mixed high explosive and fragmentation bombs, dropping in calculated patterns designed to saturate the target box. From the ground, from the American positions on the northern edge of the safety zone, the sound was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. Veterans interviewed decades later reached for the same images. A continuous physical pressure, the ground moving underfoot, dust and debris raining from a clear sky, the smell of explosive residue drifting north on the wind. And then the short bombs fell again, as on the 24th, despite everything. The perpendicular approach geometry, the aircraft drifting in turbulence or releasing fractionally early, the bomb loads following trajectories that curved north of the intended line. The 30th Division was hit a second time, then the 9th Division. Then, in a moment that the command structure would work very hard to manage in the hours and days that followed, a bomb hit a foxhole in a forward observation position occupied by a Lieutenant General named Leslie McNair. McNair was 61 years old, the commanding general of Army Ground Forces, the man primarily responsible for training and organizing the American ground forces that were fighting this war. He was in Normandy in a role that required his presence to remain secret. He had been designated the nominal commander of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a fictitious army group that existed entirely on paper as part of the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion was still coming at Calais. McNair being in Normandy meant McNair was away from the command he was supposed to be visibly commanding in England. His presence at the front had to be kept quiet. His death had to be kept quiet for the same reason, though for far more immediate logistical reasons. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the entire Second World War. What I find strangest about the McNair incident, sitting with it now, is not the tragedy of the death itself, but the administrative problem it created. The deception required that McNair be visible, notionally, in England, commanding an army group that existed only in German intelligence reports. His death eliminated the nominal commander of a fictitious force at a moment when that fiction was still operationally critical. Schaiff's response, managing the announcement, controlling the information, ensuring the Germans didn't learn through neutral channels that FUSAG's commander had just been killed on the Cobra front line, was a censorship and communications exercise conducted simultaneously with a major ground offensive. The paperwork for both was happening at the same time, in the same headquarters complex, on the same afternoon. Chapter 4. Fritz Bayerlein was 50 years old in July of 1944, a veteran of North Africa and the Eastern Front, a professionally capable officer who had served on Rommel's staff during the desert campaigns and learned a great deal about mobile armored warfare in conditions of extreme adversity. He had also seen what Allied air power could do to a formation that was caught in the open. He wasn't naive about what the Panzer-Lehr-Division was facing. In his post-war interrogation, Bayerlein described the days before the 25th of July in terms that convey a man who understood his situation and had limited means to improve it. He knew the Allies were preparing something large. He knew his division was under strength. He did not know the exact timing, and he did not know the scale. When the bombing began on the 25th, Bayerlein was in his command post. The account he gave in post-war interrogation is the closest thing we have to a German eyewitness testimony of what Cobra's bombing actually did, and it's worth taking seriously rather than simply using as a theatrical quote. He described the first wave of fighter bombers hitting the forward positions, methodical, repeated passes, targeting strong points that had been identified from aerial reconnaissance. Then the medium bombers, filling in the gaps. Then the heavies, arriving in what he described as a conveyor belt rhythm. Formation after formation, the bomb loads overlapping so that the entire target zone was being struck almost continuously. His communication links were gone within the first hour. The landline network that connected his command post to his forward battalions cut. The radio network, partially functioning intermittently with atmospherics and equipment damage degrading signals. By midday, Bayerlein was commanding a formation in name only. His battalion commanders were making their own decisions in whatever positions they still held. The effect of the bombing on Panzer-Lehr's fighting strength is one of the historiographical problems with Operation Cobra. The standard American account, drawn primarily from US after-action reports and confirmed at the broad level by Bayerlein's interrogation, presents the bombing as devastating and describes the division as essentially destroyed for the purposes of immediate resistance. The nuance that Bayerlein's own account introduces is that destroyed is a relative term. His forward battalions took catastrophic losses, but his anti-tank elements, positioned farther back from the front edge of the bomb line and therefore outside the heavier strike zone, survived in better condition. His artillery, dispersed as a matter of doctrine, was not silenced. The German soldiers who had sheltered in the deepest positions, dugouts cut below the root systems of the bocage banks, using the earthen embankments as overhead cover, survived in proportions that surprised even Bayerlein himself. When the American infantry began moving forward on the afternoon of the 25th, they encountered resistance that the bombing's apparent completeness had led them not to expect. The 30th Division, already shaken by the friendly fire casualties, hit German positions that were still fighting. The day ended with American forces having failed to break through. Collins, commanding 7th Corps, faced the evening of the 25th with information that was incomplete, contradictory, and depressing. His troops had been bombed by their own aircraft twice. His infantry divisions were exhausted and, in places, disorganized. His intelligence told him that the Panzer-Lehr had been severely damaged, but not eliminated. The conventional response to such a situation, in the tactical doctrine of the time, and arguably in any war, was to consolidate, reorganize, and renew the attack the following morning with better information. Collins made a different decision. He pushed his armoured formations forward to the front that evening, ready to attack at dawn regardless of what the night brought. The 7th Corps War Diary for the evening of the 25th records this decision matter-of-factly, as operational orders tend to record things, without the weight of what it represented. Collins was betting that the disruption to German command and control, even if the physical destruction was less than reported, was profound enough to justify exploitation before German commanders could reorganize. He was right. I've read the 7th Corps War Diary entry for the morning of the 26th several times. It has the texture of a document written by people who don't yet know what they're in the middle of. The advance is described in measured operational language: units moving, objectives reached, resistance encountered, resistance overcome. What the diary can't capture is the fact that the German front line, on that morning, was beginning to dissolve. Not because the Americans were better fighters than the Germans, not because any single tactical decision on the 26th was uniquely brilliant, but because the bombing on the 25th had destroyed Panzer-Lehr's command structure so thoroughly that the surviving German units couldn't coordinate a coherent defense. Individual strongpoints held, isolated artillery pieces fired, but the ability to organize a counterattack, to redirect reserves to the threatened points, to maintain a continuous line, that had been severed by the bombing as surely as the telephone wires had been severed. Collins understood this intuitively on the evening of the 25th. His diary didn't tell him. His experience told him. The 2nd Armoured Division went through the gap in the morning of the 26th. Through, not around, not after clearing, through. By midday they were past the strongest German positions and into open country south of the bombing box. The change in the terrain was immediate and, for men who had spent weeks dying in the bocage, almost hallucinatory. Open fields, paved roads, ground you could see across, villages that the war had barely touched yet. The armour could move at speed for the first time since D-Day. The breakout, the thing that Bradley had been careful not to promise and his men had nearly stopped believing in, was happening. The German response on the 26th was confused, disjointed, and ultimately ineffective. Bayerlein attempted to re-establish contact with his surviving units and discovered that his command post network was gone. Panzer Group West, the German armoured command in the sector, tried to feed in reserves from adjacent sectors, but the Allied air forces were now flying tactical support missions over every road leading toward the gap, and German movement in daylight was suicidal. A column of German reinforcements moving toward the breakthrough point on the 26th was identified and attacked from the air within hours of beginning its movement. The reserves didn't arrive. The gap stayed open. By the evening of the 26th, what had been a tactical penetration was becoming an operational rupture. The Panzer-Lehr-Division story doesn't end on the 25th. Units of it fought through July and into August, reconstituting from survivors, absorbing replacement personnel, holding positions in the increasingly chaotic retreat across France. Bayerlein himself survived the war. He gave his post-war interrogation with the same professional detachment that characterized the best German officers of his generation: analytical, unsentimental, precise. When he said that at least 70% of his personnel were out of action after the bombing, he was giving an estimate, not a measurement. The actual figure is unrecoverable. What's recoverable is his conclusion. His division had been functionally destroyed as a coherent fighting formation on the 25th of July, 1944, by weapons deployed from 20,000 feet by men who couldn't see the faces of the soldiers they were killing. Chapter 5. There's a phrase that military planners use that I've always found quietly revealing. The objective was achieved. It means the thing you said you were going to do, you did. It says nothing about how, or at what cost, or what was found when you got there. By the objective was achieved standard, Saint-Lô was taken on the 18th of July. The objective was achieved. The 29th Infantry Division raised its colours in the rubble. The crossroads, the reason the town mattered, the junction of roads that German logistics had been using to move supplies and reinforcements across the sector, were now in American hands. The German line had been pushed back. The Periers-Saint-Lô road, which would become Cobra's bombing reference line, was accessible. The objective was achieved. What the planners did not fully incorporate into the Cobra timeline was the cost of achieving it. The 29th Division had taken nearly 10,000 casualties over the full Normandy campaign to that point. The 35th Division, which fought alongside it in the Saint-Lô battle, was in similar condition. American infantry replacement doctrine, as practiced in the summer of 1944, sent men to the front with minimal integration time, sometimes hours after arriving in theatre. Those men didn't know their units. Their units didn't know them. The small unit cohesion that military training tries to build over months of shared hardship was absent. Veterans recall, in oral histories collected in the decades after the war, a persistent atmosphere in these replacement-heavy units of men fighting alongside strangers, unable to use the shorthand of shared experience, unable to trust what they hadn't seen. The official casualty count doesn't capture this qualitative degradation of fighting effectiveness. The paperwork records a number. It doesn't record the quality of the units that number was drawn from. The bocage that surrounded Saint-Lô was different from the bocage farther north. Closer to the city, the earthen banks were older, more overgrown, denser, the product of centuries of hedgerow management that had been interrupted by a war. German defensive engineering had adapted these natural features with extraordinary competence. Foxholes were dug into the base of the banks, using the earthen mass as overhead protection. Machine gun positions were cut to cover the natural choke points, the gaps in the hedgerows where roads passed through, the field corners where infantry was forced to bunch. Artillery observers were positioned in farm buildings with clear sight lines across multiple fields, calling fire on American units before those units had identified where the fire was coming from. The defenders had spent weeks in this terrain. The attackers changed faces every few days as replacements arrived. Ernie Pyle, the American war correspondent who followed the infantry through Normandy, and who died in the Pacific the following year, wrote about the hedgerow fighting in terms that the military histories tend to skip over because they don't fit neatly into operational analysis. He described American soldiers moving through fields so thick with smoke and dust that the next hedgerow was invisible until you were standing at it. He described the sound of a German mortar round as something you learn to identify not by hearing, but by a physical sensation, a change in the air. He described the way men who had been in combat for 6 weeks moved differently from men who had been in it for 6 days. Slower, more careful, almost economical in their expenditure of motion. Pyle's writing is journalism, not military history, and it records impressions rather than facts. But it records the texture of what Cobra was built on top of. The weeks of grinding, attritional fighting that wore the American infantry down to a point where the promise of a carpet bombing and an armored breakout felt, to some of them, like salvation. The question that Bradley was asking by early July was not whether to use heavy bombers in a tactical role. Montgomery had tried that at Caen. It had not produced the breakthrough he needed, partly because the bombing was planned too conservatively, and partly because the terrain south of Caen was different, more open, more suited to the German defensive pattern that Montgomery's armor kept running into. The question Bradley was asking was whether it was possible to use heavy bombers so intensively and so precisely in such a concentrated zone that the shock effect would temporarily paralyze German command and control completely. Not just suppress fires, but remove the ability of the German formation to function as a coordinated force at all. The answer was theoretical until the 26th of July. On the 26th, it became empirical. The men who attacked through the gap on the 26th knew none of this framing. They knew their division had been bombed by its own aircraft the previous day. They knew men they recognized were dead. They knew the landscape immediately south of their start line had been transformed by the bombing into something lunar. Craters overlapping craters, the hedgerow banks blown inward, the road surfaces cratered and impassable, everything covered in a fine layer of chalk dust from the blasted Norman subsoil. They moved forward through this landscape because they were ordered to. Some of them discovered, as they advanced, that German resistance was lighter than anything they had experienced since D-Day. Others hit surviving positions and found it was exactly as hard as it had ever been. The same operation produced both experiences simultaneously in adjacent sectors on the same morning. Collins committed his armoured exploitation forces on the evening of the 25th, before he had confirmation of what the morning would bring. This is the decision that the 7th Corps War Diary records in operational language, and that Collins's post-war memoir describes in terms that make it sound calculated and confident. I'm genuinely uncertain which account is more accurate. War diaries record what happened. Memoirs record what it felt like to have happened. The two are not always the same thing. What is clear from both is that Collins pushed the armour forward, that the 2nd Armoured Division was moving through the gap not because the situation was confirmed clear, but because Collins judged, on the basis of incomplete and partly contradictory reports, that the German command structure had been disrupted sufficiently to justify the risk. He was the 7th Corps commander. It was his decision to make. He made it, and it worked. The first American armoured units to push south of the bomb line on the 26th of July encountered something they hadn't experienced since England. Open ground. Fields without bocage. Roads that ran straight for miles without a hedgerow forcing them to slow and check. Villages where the civilian population came out into the streets, cautiously, uncertain whether these were truly Americans, or whether the front had simply shifted and the Germans had returned in new uniforms. The speed of the advance on the 26th shocked everyone, including the American commanders. The planning assumption for Cobra had not specified a particular exploitation rate because nobody was certain there would be exploitation at all. What actually happened, the armour moving miles in hours rather than yards in days, exceeded every model that the planners had developed. And that excess was about to create its own set of problems. The German front, on the 26th and 27th of July, didn't retreat. It dissolved. Units that had been holding positions the day before simply ceased to be coherent formations. German soldiers surrendered in numbers that surprised their captors. Others disappeared into the Norman countryside. Men who had been part of a division 24 hours earlier and who were now simply individuals in Feldgrau uniforms trying to find a route east before the American armour cut it. The collapse of German positional defence in the Cobra sector was not a gradual process. It happened in a space of roughly 36 hours, between the 25th and 27th of July. And it happened because the bombing had not just killed men and destroyed equipment. It had dissolved the institutional fabric of the defending force. Battalion commanders couldn't reach companies. Regimental commanders couldn't reach battalions. When the institutional fabric dissolves, formations stop being formations and become groups of individuals making individual decisions. And individual soldiers in the defense cannot stop armored columns. Chapter 6. The road through Avranches is a single lane in places. Not metaphorically single, literally. A road that, in peacetime, would carry local traffic between farms and market towns, that would be closed for a tractor crossing and passable for a lorry only with care. Between the 28th of July and the 1st of August 1944, the equivalent of a modern American metropolitan rush hour was forced through it every 6 hours. Armoured divisions, supply trucks, artillery batteries, fuel tankers, signal units dragging miles of cable, military police trying to manage the flow with hand signals and force of personality at junctions where 3 roads converged on a bridge barely wide enough for 2 vehicles abreast. The Avranches bottleneck was not an obstacle to the breakout. It was the breakout. Everything had to go through it. Avranches sits at the junction of Normandy and Brittany, on a low promontory above the bay that leads to Mont Saint-Michel. In normal times, it's a minor provincial town. In late July of 1944, it became the most important geographic point on the Western Front. Bradley's exploitation plan required his armoured forces to pass through Avranches and spread west into Brittany and south and east into the open French interior. The 4th Armoured Division, spearheading the advance, reached Avranches on the 30th of July. They found the bridge intact. They secured it. And then the question became not whether the breakout could happen, but whether the logistical system could sustain it through a road junction that hadn't been designed for military traffic on this scale. The supply mathematics of an armored division in sustained movement are not simple. A single American armored division in full operational tempo consumed approximately 25,000 gallons of fuel per 100 miles of advance. The First Army in late July had multiple armored divisions on the move simultaneously. The total fuel requirement, summed across all moving formations, ran into the hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. And the distribution system, fuel dumps, truck convoys, jerry cans, forward resupply points, had been built for an advance of perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day. The actual advance in late July was running 30 miles a day and accelerating. The distance between the supply dumps and the forward units was growing faster than the supply convoys could compensate for. This was not yet a crisis on the 29th of July. It became one in late August. But its roots were in the speed of the Avranches passage, in the moment when the operation outran its logistical assumptions. The military police managing traffic through Avranches in those days represent one of the more unglamorous forms of operational competence. There's no documentary footage of them doing their work. There are no memoirs by military policemen directing traffic at a Normandy junction at 2 a.m, while armoured columns backed up for miles behind them. What there are is logistical records showing that the passage of multiple divisions through a single corridor over 72 hours was accomplished without a catastrophic collapse, which means somebody managed it. Somebody made decisions about which formations moved when, which bridges could carry which loads, where fuel should be pre-positioned, how to route competing columns to prevent gridlock. Those decisions were made by junior officers and senior NCOs working without reliable communications in the dark, using maps and experience and improvisation. The breakout from Normandy was not achieved only by the generals. It was achieved by the military police corporal standing in the road with a torch, waving the right vehicles through in the right order. Patton's Third Army became operational on the 1st of August. The activation was a formality. Patton had been in France for weeks, notionally commanding the fictitious Fusag force as part of the deception plan, then transitioning to command of the actual Third Army as Cobra's exploitation made the deception's continuation unnecessary. When Third Army officially activated, it was positioned to exploit the gap that First Army had punched open. Bradley moved up to command the 12th Army Group. Hodges took First Army and Patton took Third. The command reorganization happened while the exploitation was already underway. Units were moving, battles were developing, and the senior command structure was simultaneously being reorganized from the top. It's the kind of thing that military organizations can do when they're winning. When you're losing, reorganizing under fire is catastrophic. When you're winning, it sometimes just adds bureaucratic confusion to an already chaotic situation. Patton's famous personality has dominated the popular telling of what happened after Avranches, and I don't want to simply reproduce that telling here. What the operational record shows, rather than the mythology, is that Third Army moved fast because the situation permitted fast movement, and because Patton's command style was suited to exploiting a fluid situation rather than managing a set-piece battle. His orders tended to specify objectives rather than methods, which gave his corps commanders latitude to find the fastest route to each objective, rather than following a prescribed axis of advance. This approach worked brilliantly when the enemy was disorganized and the terrain was open. It created logistical strain that would eventually become a crisis. The same quality that made Patton effective in exploitation, the willingness to push forward, regardless of what was happening to the supply chain, was also the quality that would leave his tanks dry of fuel 6 weeks later. The Germans, meanwhile, were trying to understand what had happened to them. Army Group B's situation reports in late July and early August, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, record a command structure struggling to process information that was arriving faster than it could be assessed. Reports of American armored penetrations in one sector were still being evaluated when reports of penetrations in adjacent sectors arrived. Von Kluge, who had taken command of Army Group B on the 17th of July, after Rommel was wounded by Allied strafing, was facing a situation that his command architecture wasn't designed to handle. German operational doctrine assumed a relatively stable front line, positions that moved slowly, giving the command system time to respond. What Cobra had created was a front line that was moving so fast it was ceasing to be a line at all. Hitler's response to the breakthrough was to order a counterattack. This is the decision that, in retrospect, looks not just wrong, but almost inexplicable. But it requires context to understand. Hitler's strategic logic, as it can be reconstructed from the orders he issued and the conference records from the Wolf's Lair in those days, was that the American columns pouring south and west through Avranches had created a long, exposed flank running roughly north-south west of the German position. If a powerful armoured force could strike westward and reach the coast near Avranches, it would cut the American exploitation columns off from their supply base. The operation, codenamed Lutic, was not inherently lunatic as a concept. Cutting an exploitation force's lines of supply is a classical response to a deep penetration. The problem was that the force available for the operation, 4 panzer divisions, each significantly below establishment strength, was nowhere near sufficient to reach the coast against American opposition that now included both substantial ground forces and overwhelming air power. What Hitler was ordering required capabilities that the German army in Normandy simply didn't possess by early August of 1944. The plan was not wrong in kind. It was wrong in scale. Catastrophically, fatally wrong in scale. The Mortain counterattack, Operation Lutic, launched in the first hours of the 7th of August, is the subject of a later chapter, but its possibility was already implicit in the situation as it stood on the 1st of August. American forces advancing south and west, German forces still holding a front to the north, and a corridor through Avranches that was both the passage for Allied exploitation and the theoretical target for a German counterstroke. Bradley, when he learned of the German intention through ultra-intelligence intercepts, made a decision that reversed the conventional logic of the situation. Instead of pulling forces back to defend Avranches, he ordered the exploitation to continue. Let the Germans attack westward, he reasoned. Every mile they advance toward Avranches is another mile they put between themselves and their own lines, and another mile of exposed flank for Allied forces coming from the south and east to envelop. He was, in effect, inviting the German counterattack because he believed it would produce the conditions for encirclement. He was right. It would. But the men holding the position at Mortain while the encirclement developed, holding it against 4 panzer divisions on a hill with 1 radio and dying batteries, had not been told any of this. Chapter 7. The 26th of July, 1944, began as a day of frustrating arithmetic. The previous afternoon's bombing had killed more than 1,000 Germans and destroyed much of the Panzer-Lehr-Division's forward strength. But the infantry of Collins's 7th Corps had still only advanced roughly a mile and a half through the shattered ground south of Saint-Lô. The bomb craters that had turned the Panzer-Lehr's positions into what German survivors described as a moonscape were the same craters that were now slowing American vehicles. The roads were gone. The fields were cratered. The very success of the bombing had created an obstacle course. And then, sometime that morning, something changed. Collins pushed his armor forward earlier than planned, and by midday on the 26th, his corps had advanced roughly 10 miles, reaching Saint-Gilles, then Cannassy, crossing the Coutances-Saint-Lô road, in what the US Army's own after-action analysis would later call an operational breakthrough. The word mattered. A tactical success becomes operational when it can't be contained. This one couldn't. The Panzer-Lehr-Division, which had entered the Cobra bombardment zone at something approaching reasonable strength for a battered formation, emerged from it as an administrative concept rather than a fighting force. General Fritz Bayerlein's post-war interrogation accounts describe the scene in terms that no amount of dry military language can entirely neutralize. Tanks overturned in craters, anti-tank guns buried under collapsed hedgerows, communications shattered across the entire front. What the bombing left standing, the fighter bombers that swept the area in the hours following, finished methodically. By the morning of the 26th, the formation that had been one of the Wehrmacht's premier armoured divisions in Normandy had been reduced to scattered elements clinging to isolated strongpoints, unable to coordinate, unable to communicate, and facing a corps of infantry and armour that had just realised the door was open. The accounts of Bayerlein's interrogation don't invent his despair. They record it in the flat, exhausted language of a man who had watched his division cease to exist in the course of a single afternoon. I find myself returning to Collins's decision on the evening of July 25th as one of the genuinely consequential judgment calls of the entire Normandy campaign. The bombing had been a disaster. 111 Americans dead from their own bombs, 490 wounded. The Army's most senior active training general killed in a foxhole. And the first day's ground advance had been almost insultingly small. Collins could have waited. He could have reassessed. The intelligence picture was incomplete. German resistance at the western edges of the penetration remained significant. Any reasonable commander could have justified caution. Instead, Collins ordered his armour forward that evening, before the official results of the first day were fully compiled, on the basis of his read of the situation rather than a definitive picture. He pushed. By the 26th, the push had become a flood. The 8th Corps, under General Troy Middleton, entered the fight on the 26th as well, ordered by Bradley to commit to action alongside Collins's breakthrough. Middleton's initial instinct, which he expressed openly and which Kevin Heimel's research for Warfare History Network documented from Corps records, was to lead with infantry. He was genuinely uncertain about what his two armoured divisions could do in exploitation. The 4th Armoured Division under Major General John Wood and the 6th Armoured Division under Major General Robert Grow had both been in Normandy, but neither had operated in the kind of open country exploitation role they'd been designed for. The bocage had seen to that. The 4th and 6th had fought as armoured formations do when terrain forces them, carefully, slowly, mechanically. Middleton knew infantry. He wasn't sure about tanks in the open. He committed the armour anyway, on July 28th, because German resistance ahead of his corps had visibly crumbled, and because standing still with two armoured divisions in your hand seemed worse than the alternative. The race to Coutances, and then south to Avranches, unfolded over 4 days in a manner that surprised everyone, including the men doing the running. The 4th Armoured's combat command sliced through German positions and reached Coutances before the larger, more experienced 3rd Armoured Division that had been tasked with taking that objective. Wood drove into the fight personally, walking streets under fire, directing tank destroyers against German 88mm guns in alleys, scribbling notes as he manoeuvred through minefields. The Warfare History Network account of Avranches records a tank destroyer crew receiving a personal order from a division commander who appeared from nowhere, pointed at a German gun, and said simply to get rid of it, then said thank you when they did. That detail comes from unit histories, not from memoir polish. It has the particular texture of something that actually happened. The convergence on Avranches itself was a barely controlled chaos of the kind that military historians, writing decades later with full maps and complete records, can make look coherent, but which was, at the time, an experience of profound uncertainty. 2 armoured divisions, multiple infantry divisions, a corps headquarters, and the ghost of a third army waiting to become operational were all trying to funnel through a mountain town at the corner of the Cotentin Peninsula, where roads that had served a rural French community for a century were suddenly expected to handle the traffic of a modern industrial army. The Pontobolt Bridge over the Saloon River, south of Avranches, became the operational hinge of the entire campaign. It was intact. The Germans hadn't destroyed it. Nobody on either side could quite explain why, and that unexplained survival changed everything. Patton officially took command of the Third Army on the 1st of August, 1944. The Third Army became operational at noon that day, and Patton inherited from Middleton's 8th Corps the perfect starting position for everything he'd been designed by temperament and training to do. Exploit, advance, and don't stop for questions. Middleton had advanced roughly 44 miles in 4 days, taken more than 7,000 prisoners at the cost of approximately 700 American casualties, and forced open what would become the gateway through which Patton would pour 7 divisions in 72 hours. The records of those 72 hours read like a logistics fever dream. Division after division threading through the same ruined streets. MPs working crossing guard duty in the rubble. Commanders personally directing traffic because the alternative was gridlock. It worked. It barely worked. But it worked. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, told his Chief of Staff on the 31st of July, a quote preserved in the historical record of the 12 turning points of the Second World War, and echoed in the Warfare History Network account, that someone had to tell the Führer that if the Americans got through at Avranches, they would be out of the woods. They'd be able to do what they pleased. The statement was accurate. It was also, by the time it was made, a description of something that had already happened. The Americans were through. They were doing what they pleased. And Hitler's response to this information would produce one of the most catastrophic strategic decisions of the entire Western campaign. Patton's orders for the Third Army reflected both his operational instincts and the constraints of a command structure that still wasn't entirely sure what to do with him. 8th Corps was directed west into Brittany, toward Brest, Lorient, Saint-Malo, chasing the ports that Bradley believed were essential for the long-term logistics of the campaign. 15th Corps under General Wade Hayslip was directed east and south, in the direction of Le Mans. The Brittany operation would prove to be a significant strategic miscalculation, diverting armour into a peninsula where the Germans had fortified the ports and would hold them for months, delivering almost nothing of the logistical value that Bradley anticipated. The ports he so eagerly chased were not usable in time to matter. But in the first week of August, with the German line dissolving ahead of the Third Army and the map unfolding in every direction, this particular error was still invisible. The mood at Third Army headquarters in those first days of August sits in the record as something between controlled excitement and barely suppressed disbelief. The men who had spent the previous 2 months eating cold rations in flooded foxholes 20 yards from the enemy were now watching French towns appear at the rate of several per day, watching prisoners materialize in groups too large to process efficiently, watching the army run off the edges of maps that had been issued for a campaign that was supposed to be methodical and grinding. Private Harry Crews of the 6th Armored Division, whose account appears in the Warfare History Network narrative, described driving past the destruction along the roads south of Avranches. Dead horses, burned vehicles, a dead American soldier, and thinking, that's when I knew what war was. He wasn't talking about the speed or the liberation or the tactical elegance. He was talking about what it actually looked like on the ground when an army ceased to hold. What Cobra had produced by the 1st of August was a genuine operational crisis for the German army in the West. Not a defeat in the conventional sense, where lines are pushed back in an orderly way, but a dissolution, a structural failure of the kind that turns an organized defense into a collection of confused individuals trying to find their units, and their units trying to find their mission. The 7th German Army was, functionally, disintegrating. The 5th Panzer Army was holding elements of its front against the British and Canadians, but losing cohesion as reserves were stripped to plug gaps elsewhere. Army Group B was issuing orders to formations that could no longer receive them, or that received them without the means to comply. And Hitler, watching all of this from his headquarters, was preparing to fix it with the instrument that had already been broken: a massive armoured counterattack to Avranches. Chapter 8. There's something almost arithmetically cruel about the situation the German panzer divisions found themselves in during the first week of August 1944. Hitler's order for Operation Lüttich, the counterattack toward Avranches designed to sever Patton's supply line and reverse the Allied breakthrough in a single stroke, called for 8 armoured divisions to strike west to the sea. The German army in Normandy didn't have 8 operational armoured divisions anymore. It had formations with armoured designations and increasingly small numbers of functional tanks. The 9th Panzer had 12. The 1st SS Panzer had 21. The grand counterattack that Hitler envisioned, the kind of concentrated armoured blow that had worked in the summer of 1941 across entirely different terrain against an entirely different enemy, was being ordered into existence by a headquarters that had stopped reading the strength returns with sufficient care. The order was real. The army, it assumed, did not exist. Von Kluge understood this. General Hans von Funk, commanding the panzer force assigned to carry out Lüttich, understood it too, and formally requested a postponement. The request was denied. The operational planning proceeded anyway, because in the German command structure of the summer of 1944, the alternative to executing Hitler's orders was implication in a conspiracy that had just been violently suppressed. The officers who had attempted to kill Hitler on the 20th of July were being executed as the Lüttich planning commenced. Von Kluge himself had been approached by the conspirators and had declined to participate. But the SD, the security service, knew about the contact. He was a man executing orders he believed were impossible, partly because the credible alternative was a show trial and a firing squad. That context, documented in subsequent German historical accounts and in the Bundesarchiv records of the period, matters enormously for understanding why Lüttich happened the way it did. The plan called for the attack to begin at 2200 hours on the night of the 6th to 7th of August. The launch was immediately compromised. The units weren't fully in position. Radio discipline had broken down. The Warfare History Network account notes that the 2nd Panzer Division broke radio silence at 2 in the afternoon on the 6th of August and asked for nighttime air support in preparation for an attack, a message that was intercepted by Allied signals intelligence. At 2001 and 2140 on the 6th, and at 011 on the 7th, emergency signals went from the intelligence network to Allied commanders. The warning was fragmentary, arrived in pieces, and left almost no time for redeployment. What it did give Bradley was enough information to make a decision about the bigger picture, and that decision would be more consequential than anything von Funk could do with his depleted panzer force. Me sitting with the ultra debate on this, the question of whether advance warning genuinely changed the Allied response at Mortain, is one of those moments where the research friction is real and doesn't resolve cleanly. Richard Overy, in Why the Allies Won, asserts that Ultra gave meaningful advance warning. The American Air Force Historical Series account of air operations over Normandy pushes back, recording that the critical decrypt arrived at midnight, essentially as the attack was beginning. British Intelligence in the Second World War, Volume 3, Part 2, records the signal fragments arriving across a 3-hour window before the assault. The honest answer is that the intelligence arrived too late to redeploy forces, but potentially in time to confirm for Bradley that holding position and letting the German attack develop was strategically sound. That is, that the Mortain counteroffensive was real, was committed and was going to fail. Bradley chose not to redirect his exploitation forces. He let the Germans come. That decision, made in the hours before the attack began, shaped the entire subsequent shape of the campaign. The 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, had arrived at Mortain on the afternoon of the 6th of August, expecting a rest area. The 18th Infantry of the 1st Infantry Division, which they were relieving, reported they hadn't seen a German soldier in 5 days. The hill above the town, Hill 314, offered views across the surrounding plains for up to 15 miles in every direction. The forward observers of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion set up their positions in the summer afternoon, pre-registered artillery targets on the roads below, and settled in. Lieutenant Robert Weiss chose the high ground on the east side of the hill. Corporal Frank Denius, who had already earned a Silver Star in the hedgerow fighting and had been within 60 yards of General McNair's position when the bomb fell, was assigned to the west. Lieutenant Charles Bartz, newly arrived, his first real combat command, was placed with Denius. The Warfare History Network account records that Weiss wrote of Bartz after the war. He always seemed to be looking over his shoulder, and I could already see the pale stamp of death on his face. That wasn't sentiment in retrospect. That was a professional judgment about readiness, written in the measured language of a soldier's memoir. By the early hours of the 7th, the hill was surrounded. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer, the 116th Panzer, and elements of the 1st SS Leibstandarte had come in from multiple directions, moving through the early morning dark and the fog that made the first hours of the 7th of August almost opaque. The town of Mortain fell quickly. German troops entered its streets before dawn, and the first intelligence about their presence came partly from French civilians who had remained, and who were passing information to the defenders through whatever channels they could find. The 38th minute after midnight record in the 30th Division's log, the entry documenting the report of a possible enemy counterattack within 12 hours, was already obsolete before anyone read it. The attack had arrived before the warning. The defense of Hill 314 worked because of fire, not because of the infantry's numerical strength. 690 men, as the 230th Field Artillery Battalion history records, with ammunition running low within the first day, but because 2 forward observers, on opposite sides of a limestone outcrop, could see the roads below and direct artillery from batteries 5 miles away onto anything that moved. Weiss would make 193 fire mission calls over 6 days. Denius, on his side of the hill, recalls in his memoir, titled On the Way, that, while Lieutenant Weiss called in artillery on the east and southeast, I called it for the south and southwest. We laid a solid ring of fire on them. Their casualties and vehicle damage were incredible. The few undamaged German vehicles withdrew to the east, loaded with men fleeing from a killing ground. That's a primary source. That's the man who was there, on the hill, describing what he saw. The radio batteries were the most critical single resource on that hill, and the story of how they were managed is a study in improvisation under pressure that no operational account captures adequately. Each radio set weighed roughly 75 pounds, including its battery pack. Battery life was finite, and the hill was cut off. No resupply, no rotation, no fresh power. Denius hit upon the idea of leaving batteries in direct sunlight to capture whatever charge the heat could produce. It gave them roughly 6 additional minutes per cycle. 6 minutes. That's how close the communications margin was between the forward observers and the artillery batteries that were keeping the German armor off the hill. 6 minutes of sunshine on a dying battery. The aerial dimension of the battle was substantial and documented. On the 7th of August alone, American fighter aircraft flew 429 sorties over German positions in the Mortain area. RAF Typhoons, which had developed into a particularly effective ground attack platform for dealing with German armor, fired more than 2,000 rockets at tanks and vehicles in the valleys below the hill. The smoke from burning German armor was visible from the observation posts on top of Hill 314, and the forward observers used it as a reference point for subsequent fire missions. The battalion history records 78 American casualties on the 7th alone. The Warfare History Network account notes that of the 690 men who had occupied Hill 314 on the afternoon of the 6th, 277 were killed, missing, or taken prisoner by the time the 35th Division arrived to relieve them. The German failure at Mortain was not simply a failure of air power or artillery or American bravery, though it was all three of those things. It was a failure of concept. The operation assumed that panzer divisions, at a fraction of their authorized strength, could drive 40 miles through terrain controlled by an enemy with unchallenged air superiority, past a defended ridge that could see for 15 miles in every direction, with fuel allocations that the Bundesarchiv diary had already recorded as insufficient for the mission's duration. The gap between what the order required and what the material reality would support was not a rounding error, it was the entire operation. Von Kluge told his chief of staff on the 31st of July that someone had to tell Hitler the truth about Avranches. Nobody did. Lüttich was the consequence. Chapter 9. While Hill 314 was holding and the German panzer attack at Mortain was grinding itself apart against artillery fire and airstrikes, something was happening in the larger operational frame that the men on the hill couldn't see and didn't know about. Bradley was not redirecting forces to meet the German attack. He was accelerating them in the opposite direction. The logic, once you understand it, is almost elegant. If Hitler was committing his remaining panzer reserves to a westward push toward Avranches, then those reserves were moving away from the Seine, away from the exits, and deeper into a pocket that was already forming around them. The German army was walking into a closing fist. Bradley's response to Mortain wasn't defensive, it was to tighten the fist. The concept of the encirclement that would become the Falaise Pocket emerged from the convergence of several separate decisions made at different levels of the command hierarchy in the first weeks of August. General Bernard Montgomery, as the overall ground forces commander, ordered British and Canadian forces to press south toward Troun and Chambois in the Dives Valley. The Americans were directed toward Argentan. Between the two jaws, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army would be encircled. The history hit account of the pocket stages describes the escape route that remained by the time Hitler finally authorized withdrawal on the 16th of August as a corridor between Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, measuring approximately 2 miles across. 2 miles. For the remnants of an army group. Patton's 15th Corps under General Hayslip had been driving east and south from the Avranches Gap since the 1st of August. By the 12th, 15th Corps had reached Argentan, the southern anchor of the closing pocket, and was positioned to push north toward Falaise, potentially closing the gap from the south, while the Canadians pushed down from the north. The distance between the two jaws was roughly 25 miles. Hayslip wanted to go. His corps had momentum, and the German resistance ahead of him was, by the records of the period, not organized enough to constitute a genuine obstacle. Then the phone rang at Bradley's headquarters, and the order came down. Stop at Argentan. Don't go beyond. Hold in place. Bradley's reasoning, as he would record it in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, centered on the army group boundary. 15th Corps was operating close to, or across the operational line that divided American and British Canadian areas of responsibility, and on his concern about a head-on collision between converging American and Canadian forces in the confusion and dark of a closing pocket. I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to the possibility of a broken neck at Falaise, he wrote. The phrase is clean and quotable, and has been debated by military historians ever since. The contemporary operational diary entry, terse, immediate, institutional, captures none of that rhetorical polish. It records the halt and the flanks and the bombs still fused in the ground ahead, and the uncertainty about German strength. Bradley believed, based on his intelligence picture at the time, that up to 19 German divisions might be fighting their way through the gap. The contemporaneous records, reviewed by the US Army's official history, suggest that assessment was significantly higher than the actual combat power those divisions represented by mid-August. The Canadian First Army's push from the north, Operation Tractable, launched on the 14th of August, involved 800 heavy bombers delivering 3,700 tons of bombs on German positions south of Falaise. The subsequent Canadian and Polish armoured advance brought those forces within 3 miles of Falaise itself. It also inflicted approximately 400 casualties on Canadian and Polish units through friendly fire, the third major instance of Allied bombing striking Allied troops in the Normandy campaign. The northern jaw was moving, but it was moving slowly, and the 5 days that elapsed between Bradley's halt order on the 13th and the Canadian entry into Falaise on the 16th represented the critical window through which the majority of what could have been captured German personnel escaped eastward. I've spent time with the historiography of the Argentan halt, and I'm not convinced it resolves cleanly into either vindication or indictment. The critics, Max Hastings among the most prominent, argue that the halt cost the Allies the near-complete destruction of 2 German armies and allowed the veteran survivors who escaped to form the core of the German defence in the autumn and winter campaigns. The defenders of Bradley's decision, Carlo D'Este's careful reading of the operational context, is probably the most rigorous, argue that closing the gap physically with American and Canadian forces meeting in the middle was a genuinely dangerous operation that Bradley had legitimate reasons to avoid, given his intelligence picture at the time. What's not debatable is the arithmetic. Somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 German soldiers escaped through the gap over those days, and many of them would be encountered again at the Bulge, along the Siegfried Line, and at the Rhine crossings. The gap cost the Allies something. How much it cost them is still being argued. The supply and logistics situation was already showing the strain of the pursuit speed, the Avranches bottleneck. 7 divisions through the same ruined mountain town in 72 hours had been a logistical improvisation of the highest order, and improvisations at that scale leave debts. Fuel consumption for an armoured division moving 100 miles ran to roughly 25,000 gallons. Third Army had multiple armoured divisions in motion simultaneously. The Quartermaster Corps was developing the Red Ball Express as a response, but the Express was still being organised in August. The gap between demand and supply was already visible in the records of the period, even if it hadn't yet become the operational crisis it would become in September. The army was running fast, and the fuel was running out, and the commanders who needed to know this were focused on the enemy in front of them, rather than the logistics behind them. The Polish 1st Armoured Division entered the picture as part of the Canadian First Army, and their role in the final closing of the pocket represents one of the most extraordinary small unit performances of the entire Normandy campaign. Under General Stanislav Maciek, the Poles captured Hill 262, a ridge directly overlooking the Chambois-Saint-Lambert escape corridor, on the 19th of August, and held it against the desperate pressure of German forces fighting their way out of the pocket. 1,500 Polish soldiers, approximately 100,000 Germans trying to get through. The History Hit account quotes Montgomery's address to the Polish forces after the battle. The Germans were trapped as if in a bottle. You were the cork in that bottle. The Poles lost 350 men holding that ridge. They held it. The pocket was sealed on the 21st of August, 1944, when Canadian 4th Armoured and Polish 1st Armoured Divisions linked up against the remaining German resistance around Chambois. The History Hit account records approximately 60,000 soldiers of Army Group B trapped inside by that point, 50,000 of whom were taken prisoner, with roughly 10,000 killed by artillery and airstrikes inside the pocket. Eisenhower visited the site 2 days after the closing, and his account, preserved in his memoir Crusade in Europe, is one of the most quoted passages from the entire Normandy campaign. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it on foot, to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. Eisenhower wasn't given to literary excess. When he reached for Dante, he meant it. The gap between what the Falaise Encirclement achieved and what it might have achieved under different decisions at Argentan is the kind of question that can't be answered with certainty, only argued with evidence. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. The German army that emerged from the Falaise Pocket in the last days of August was not an army in any meaningful operational sense. It was a collection of survivors dispersed across the French countryside, lacking most of their heavy equipment, their signals infrastructure, their logistics trains, their unit cohesion. The formations that had entered the pocket as named divisions, the 2nd SS Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, the 9th Panzer, emerged without the equipment that made them divisions. They had the designations and many of the officers and some of the men. The tanks, the guns, the vehicles, the radio nets, the supply depots, those were burning in the lanes around Moissy. Chapter 10. The liberation of Paris on the 25th of August, 1944, should not have happened when it did. That is not a criticism. It's a description of a plan that reality overrode in the most productive possible way. Eisenhower's operational design for the exploitation of the Cobra breakout had envisioned bypassing Paris, surrounding it, isolating it, leaving it to fall later when the supply situation was more favorable and the German garrison had been cut off from any meaningful support. Paris was a logistics liability, not an asset. A city of several million people requiring food, fuel, and administration at a moment when those resources were needed for the armies still fighting. The plan to bypass it was not callous. It was a rational reading of industrial military arithmetic. What changed the plan was the city itself. The Paris uprising began on the 19th of August, 1944, when members of the French resistance took control of the police prefecture and began expanding their hold on central Paris. The Vichy administrative structure was collapsing. The German garrison, approximately 17,000 men under General Dietrich von Holtitz, was receiving orders from Hitler that included explicit instructions to destroy the bridges, flood the Seine, and demolish the major monuments before surrendering. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the bridges of the Seine, all were slated for demolition. Hitler's order was specific and was transmitted to Holtitz in writing. The city was supposed to burn. Holtitz didn't burn it. His memoir, Soldat unter Soldaten, explains his reasoning, and historians have spent decades debating whether his account is accurate or self-serving in retrospect, almost certainly some of both. What isn't debated is the outcome. The bridges stood, the monuments stood, and when French General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division entered Paris on the 22nd of August, followed by American forces of the 4th Infantry Division, they drove through a city that was structurally intact. French resistance fighters and German garrison soldiers were still exchanging fire in pockets around the city when Leclerc's tanks reached the center. The fighting wasn't over, but the city was there. The decision to send Leclerc's French division into Paris ahead of American units was both a political calculation and an operational one. Charles de Gaulle, who would enter Paris on the 25th of August for his own carefully staged march, had been insisting on the symbolic importance of French forces being first into the capital. Eisenhower understood, as a political military commander in the specific sense of someone who had to manage alliances as well as armies, that the French stake in this particular moment was real and legitimate. The decision to allow French forces to lead the entry had consequences that extended well beyond August 1944. De Gaulle's political authority in post-war France was substantially built on the imagery of that march. Military decisions cast long shadows. The veterans who drove or walked into Paris in those last days of August described the experience in terms that the operational histories can't quite contain. Me reading through the oral accounts of that entry, and I've spent time with several collected in the post-war period, what strikes me isn't the celebration, though the celebration was real and the photographs confirm it. Men on tanks being handed wine and flowers and kissed by strangers. What strikes me is the dissonance that many of the soldiers describe. The men who had been in the bocage in July, who had crawled 20 yards a day through hedgerows that smelled of death, who had eaten cold rations in flooded foxholes and watched their friends disappear. Those men drove into Paris in late August and were handed flowers by women in summer dresses. The cognitive distance between those two experiences was enormous, and many of the accounts register it not as triumph, but as strangeness. The war wasn't over, it just looked different for a few days. The strategic significance of Paris's liberation extended beyond the symbolic. The French capital was a major rail junction, a communications hub, and the psychological center of occupied Europe. Its fall to the Allies, publicly, visibly, with French forces leading and de Gaulle walking the Champs-Élysées, accelerated the political collapse of collaborationist structures across France and Belgium. German garrison commanders in cities throughout northern France and Belgium began reassessing their options. The Wehrmacht's political psychological architecture in Western Europe was fragmenting at a pace that the military collapse was enabling but not fully causing. Paris was the signal that the system was over. The logistics picture behind the liberation was darker than the images of celebration suggested. Third Army, which had been moving at extraordinary speed since the 1st of August, was already operating on fuel margins that the Transportation Corps records would later reveal as dangerously thin. The Red Ball Express had been formally established on the 25th of August, the same day Paris was liberated, as a direct response to the growing crisis between supply and demand. The highway loop from the Normandy depots to forward supply points was designed to keep the armies moving. It would eventually move more than 412,000 tons of supplies over 82 days. It would also consume roughly 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just in the operation of its own trucks. Fuel that was being drawn from the same increasingly strained supply pool it was supposed to replenish. The German army that had escaped the Falaise Pocket was retreating east across France in a condition that defied normal military taxonomy. It wasn't a fighting retreat in any organized sense. It was a flight, conducted in the vehicles that still ran and on foot where vehicles had run out, actors across a country whose civilian population now made no secret of its sympathies. Resistance groups harassed the retreating columns. Allied air power attacked anything that moved on the roads during daylight hours. The German formations that had entered Normandy as operational divisions were reaching the Seine as survivors, most of them without the heavy equipment that gave them their operational designation. They crossed where they could find boats and rafts and intact bridges, a process that the Allied air forces complicated but couldn't entirely stop. By the 25th of August, most of what remained of Army Group B was across the Seine and heading for the German border. What the Allies had achieved between the 25th of July and the 25th of August, 52 days from the first bomb of Operation Cobra to the liberation of Paris, was the near-complete destruction of Germany's strategic position in the West. Two armies had been gutted. France had been liberated across an enormous arc from Normandy to Paris. The German defensive line that Hitler had expected to hold through the autumn of 1944 had collapsed entirely. The path to the German border appeared open, and the armies needed to walk that path were running out of fuel. The triumph and the crisis arrived together, as they have a way of doing, and the men celebrating in Paris on the 25th of August had very little idea that the next 3 months would be harder than anyone in those liberated streets wanted to believe. Chapter 11. The question of what Operation Cobra actually achieved, not what happened, but what it meant, is one that military historians have been arguing since the autumn of 1944, which is to say, since before the war was even over. The immediate achievement was visible and measurable. 2 German armies gutted, France liberated, Paris free, the Wehrmacht in the West reduced from a strategic force to a desperate collection of survivors, trying to reach the comparative safety of prepared German defences. That much is clear. What's less clear, and what the argument has been about ever since, is whether the achievement could have been larger, whether the decisions at Argentan and in the days around it cost the Allies something irretrievable. The historiographical tradition on this question divides roughly into what might be called the completed triumph school and the missed opportunity school, and neither position is quite as clean as its proponents sometimes imply. The completed triumph argument, associated with writers who emphasize the genuine strategic transformation that Cobra and its exploitation produced, notes that the German army in the West was decisively defeated, that France was liberated faster than any optimistic pre-war planning had envisioned, and that the subsequent autumn and winter campaigns, however costly, were fought against an enemy that never recovered the operational coherence it had possessed in June of 1944. The missed opportunity argument, associated with writers who emphasize the Argentan Gap, the escaped German veterans, and the subsequent strength of German resistance at the Bulge and along the Siegfried Line, notes that 20,000 to 50,000 experienced German soldiers escaped through a gap that didn't have to exist, and that those soldiers formed the backbone of later resistance. Both arguments are supported by evidence. Neither is conclusive. The replacement system sits at the center of any honest evaluation of what Cobra cost. The First Army's losses between D-Day and the end of July were approximately 100,000 casualties across all categories. The official US Army figures, cited in the National Defense University materials, show 9,939 casualties in the 29th Infantry Division alone, 7,876 in another formation, figures that represent near-complete turnover of frontline combat strength for those units multiple times. The replacement personnel who arrived to fill those losses were, by the Army's own assessment documented in the Abiblio Hyperwar series, frequently inadequate, not through any fault of their own, but because they'd been trained for a different kind of warfare than they encountered in the bocage, and because the unit cohesion that makes infantry effective can't be manufactured from a personnel roster. Collins's own account describes the First Army that launched Cobra as better than the army that had started the hedgerow fighting, which is true, but it was still an army carrying a significant weight of attrition and replacement that never fully showed up in the operational maps. The Panzer-Lehr-Division deserves its own moment of careful examination, because what happened to it under the bombing of the 25th of July reveals something about the relationship between air power and ground exploitation that the doctrine of the period hadn't fully worked out. Byerline's post-war interrogation accounts describe a formation that was functionally destroyed by the bombing, craters touching rim to rim, vehicles overturned, communications shattered, the zone looking like a moonscape by the time the bombers had finished. And yet Collins's infantry, pushing into that zone on the afternoon of the 25th, found significant resistance at the edges. The bombing had destroyed the formation's center, but hadn't reached its flanks. The exploitation on the 26th worked not because the bombing had cleared the way for a clean advance, but because Collins pushed armor into an incomplete penetration on the basis of his assessment that the enemy's cohesion had failed, even where his physical presence remained. That judgment was correct. It was also a judgment that could have been wrong, And the records don't suggest Collins knew it was correct at the time he made it. He assessed, he pushed, and the assessment turned out to be right. Air power's relationship to ground exploitation in Cobra is one of those doctrinal questions that the operation both advanced and complicated. The bombing of the 25th did what carpet bombing could do. It destroyed a large amount of German material and organizational capacity in a defined zone. But it couldn't do what ground forces required it to do, which was to clear a path so unambiguous that exploitation could begin immediately and safely. The friendly fire casualties, 111 American dead, 490 wounded, 164 acute stress cases, were the price of using strategic bombers in a tactical role. And Tedder's 1945 parliamentary testimony, with its careful acknowledgement of an uncomfortably narrow margin of safety, captures the institutional recognition of that price without quite admitting that the price was too high. The subsequent development of better air-ground coordination procedures, the VHF radios in lead tanks that Quesada had installed before Cobra to enable tanker-pilot communication, the Horsefly L-5 liaison aircraft that emerged from the campaign's lessons, represents the operational learning that costly experience generates. The supply chain story, which was visible in August but didn't become critical until September, has a particular quality of inevitability when you read the logistics records carefully. The pre-war planning for the European campaign had assumed a more methodical operational pace, one that Cobra's success had completely invalidated. The port capacity assumed by the planners was the port capacity of a campaign that was supposed to be advancing step by step. The campaign that was actually happening was outrunning its logistics architecture at a rate that the architecture couldn't absorb. The Red Ball Express was a response to this reality, and it was a heroic and effective response that bought the armies weeks of operational momentum they wouldn't otherwise have had. But it was also, structurally, a system that was consuming significant amounts of the resources it was delivering, and it couldn't solve the underlying problem of a supply chain that needed months of port development to function at the scale the armies required. The German command structure's failure during and after Cobra deserves recognition not as a study in the deficiencies of German generalship. The tactical and operational quality of German commanders remained high throughout the period, but as a study in what happens when a command structure is simultaneously facing military catastrophe and political terror. Von Kluge was executing impossible orders, partly because the credible alternative was death. His generals were disagreeing with Hitler's operational concepts in private and complying with them in practice, because the July 20th plot had made non-compliance explicitly fatal. The Bundesarchiv records of the period document this with the flat precision of bureaucratic language. Fuel insufficient for the mission. Divisions at fractions of authorized strength. Orders being transmitted to formations that no longer had the communications to receive them. The military machine was functioning in a formal sense, while failing in every material sense, and the men at its top were being asked to manage that contradiction without the freedom to describe it honestly to the person giving the orders. The French civilian dimension of the Cobra period, which tends to disappear from operational histories focused on corps-level movements, was substantial and complicated. The carpet bombing south of Saint-Lô destroyed significant French civilian infrastructure and killed French civilians, not in numbers that the Allied commanders tracked with precision, but in numbers that the French historical record has documented at length. The liberation of Paris was celebrated in photographs that became iconic, but between Saint-Lô and Paris, there were weeks of advance through French towns and villages where the arrival of Allied forces was preceded by bombardment that left buildings in rubble and civilians dead. The operational history and the civilian history of the same period can look like different events. They weren't. The Allied command structure that produced Cobra, Bradley, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Patton, Collins, Middleton, Hayslip, the corps and division commanders below them, was not a harmonious organization. It was a coalition of national armies with different institutional cultures, different operational doctrines, different command philosophies, and genuine personal tensions between their senior leaders. The friction between Patton and Bradley, between Bradley and Montgomery, between Montgomery and Eisenhower, appears in all four of their subsequent memoirs, and the memoirs don't agree with each other. The contemporaneous headquarters diaries, where they're available, don't entirely agree with the memoirs either. What the friction produced, despite itself, was an operational result that was larger than any single commander could claim credit for. That's not how military history is usually written, but it's closer to how it usually happens. Chapter 12. On the 22nd of August, 1944, Eisenhower visited the area around Moissy in the Dives Valley, 2 days after the Falaise Pocket had been sealed. He was escorted through the lanes on foot. What he described afterward, the passage appears in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, was a scene that resisted the language of operational reporting and required, as he put it, Dante to describe adequately. The narrowest lanes of rural Normandy, which had served as the final escape corridor for Army Group B, had become, in the 2 weeks since the trap had closed, the most concentrated zone of military wreckage in the Western campaign. German equipment of every kind, tanks, artillery, horse-drawn vehicles, staff cars, motorcycles, was packed into those lanes in the density of a failed attempt to move an entire army through a bottleneck 2 miles wide. Most of it had been struck by air power or artillery while moving. The horses that had been pulling the Wehrmacht's surprisingly large complement of horse-drawn supply transport had died where they were hit. The men who had not made it out of the pocket were still there. The numbers from the Falaise Encirclement vary by source and methodology, and the variation itself is a kind of historical evidence. The Wikipedia summary, drawing on multiple secondary accounts, suggests roughly 80,000 to 100,000 Germans trapped inside the pocket. The Imperial War Museum's estimate holds approximately 50,000 escaped, and another 60,000 were killed or captured by the 22nd of August. The History Hit account, drawing on more recent scholarship, records approximately 60,000 trapped at the final closure, 50,000 taken prisoner, and around 10,000 killed inside the pocket. The range reflects the genuine difficulty of counting an army that was disintegrating while being counted. Whatever the precise number, the operational result was the same. The German army in the West had been gutted in a way that the autumn rains and the Siegfried Line and Hitler's December offensive in the Ardennes could complicate, but not reverse. The German formations that escaped, the veterans of the Panzer divisions, the staff officers who slipped out ahead of the closure, the infantry survivors who crossed the Seine in whatever boats they could find, took with them almost none of the heavy equipment that made them operationally significant. They had their training, their experience, their organizational memory. They had almost no tanks, no artillery, no vehicles, no supply infrastructure. When they reached the German border and began rebuilding behind the West Wall, they were rebuilding from individual human capital rather than from material strength. That rebuilding took time that the Allied logistical pause in September inadvertently provided. The September logistics crisis, which began building in late August and became unmistakable in the first week of September, remains one of the most debated questions of the European campaign. Martin van Creveld's 1977 logistics study argued that the Allied supply system was always going to reach its limits somewhere east of Paris, regardless of operational decisions, because the physics of moving fuel and ammunition across the distances involved, from Normandy beaches to advancing front lines, was simply beyond the capacity of the system that had been built. Others have argued that better priority decisions, particularly around the allocation of fuel between army groups and the abandonment of the Brittany port effort in favor of a concentrated push toward the Rhine, could have sustained the momentum longer. The 31st of August figure, Patton's daily gasoline allotment cut from 400,000 gallons to 31,000 gallons on a single day, is the sharpest single data point in this argument. That's a 92% reduction in one day for an army in full pursuit. Whether that reduction was the inevitable consequence of overextension or the result of specific priority decisions that could have been made differently is the question that historians continue to argue. What Cobra had achieved by the time the pocket closed and Paris celebrated was a demonstration of what air-land integration could accomplish when it worked, and a simultaneous demonstration of what it cost when it didn't. The bombing of the 25th of July destroyed a German division and killed 111 Americans. The exploitation that followed broke the German line and liberated France in 30 days. The friendly fire was real. The operational success was real. Both are part of the same event. Military history tends to want to separate them, to file the friendly fire under tragic friction and the exploitation under decisive victory. But the commanders who planned Cobra knew they were accepting one in order to attempt the other. That trade was explicitly discussed in the planning conferences, even if the specific cost couldn't have been, anticipated. The experience of the men who fought through Cobra and the Falaise Encirclement registered something that the operational record doesn't fully contain. The 30th Infantry Division's Presidential Unit Citation for the defense of Mortain, the formal institutional recognition of what happened on Hill 314, acknowledges the division's outstanding performance of duty against vastly superior enemy forces. The language is correct and inadequate simultaneously. 6 days, 193 fire missions, batteries charged in sunlight to buy 6 extra minutes, morphine and penicillin delivered by hollow artillery shells, most of the contents destroyed by the firing process. 3 women, Mrs. Lazen, Mrs. Veuve Baudin, the women recorded by French local historians, pumping water from a farm well on a hill surrounded by SS troops, because the Americans needed water and they had a pump. History records the unit. It struggles with the specifics of why the unit held. The German army's final accounting in Normandy was written in the Bundesarchiv, and in the subsequent staff histories, and in the interrogation reports of captured commanders, and it consistently describes the same structural failure. Orders that assumed resources that didn't exist, operations planned against enemy capabilities that had been superseded by events, a command system that was militarily competent at every level below the operational, and structurally broken at the political strategic level, where the decisions that mattered were being made. Von Kluge was relieved on the 19th of August and replaced by Model. Kluge took cyanide in a staff car on a French road, leaving a letter warning Hitler that the war was lost. Model arrived to find an army group that was already, in operational terms, finished. The efficiency of his management over the following weeks is documented in German records, but it was the efficiency of managing a withdrawal, not reversing a defeat. The Falaise Pocket closed on the 21st of August. Paris was liberated on the 25th, and the Allied armies were at the Seine in strength before the end of the month. The German border was roughly 300 miles to the east. The fuel was running out. The armies that had broken through at Saint-Lô and encircled 2 German armies and liberated the French capital were going to run out of momentum before they ran out of road. And the German soldiers who had slipped through the gap at Chambois, the ones who crossed the Seine on rafts and reached the German border on foot, those men would be waiting for them. They had no tanks. They had experience. And they had a defensive line that Allied logistics were about to inadvertently give them time to occupy. The campaign wasn't over. It had just changed shape, the way campaigns do when one phase ends before the next has been fully prepared for. The arithmetic of autumn 1944 was already being written, in fuel ledgers and strength returns, and the specific silence of a German army that had been beaten but not destroyed, regrouping behind a border that the Allies were no longer moving fast enough to reach. Chapter 13. There is a document in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, Record Group 407, a 3rd Army G4 logistics ledger for the 31st of August 1944. And it contains a single line that, once you've read it, changes how you see everything that came before and after. On that date, General George Patton's daily gasoline allotment was cut from 400,000 gallons to 31,000 gallons. That is not a typo. That is a 92% reduction in a single day for an army in full pursuit of a broken enemy across open country. The numbers don't argue. They don't explain themselves. They just sit there, in faded ink, indifferent to the ambitions of the man who needed the fuel and the glory he believed was waiting for him beyond the Seine. To understand what that number means, you have to understand what an armored division actually consumes. Each division moving 100 miles burns roughly 25,000 gallons of gasoline. Patton had multiple armored divisions in motion simultaneously in late August, racing across terrain that favored exactly the kind of deep exploitation he had spent his entire career dreaming about. The math is straightforward. 31,000 gallons wasn't enough to sustain a single division for a single day of serious movement, let alone an entire army chasing a collapsing Wehrmacht across France. That's not logistics. That's a tourniquet applied to a runner's leg in the middle of a sprint. The Red Ball Express was the Allied answer to this problem, and it was simultaneously a triumph of organizational improvisation and a warning about the limits of improvisation at strategic scale. Established on the 25th of August, 1944, the Express was a one-way highway loop running from the Normandy depots to forward supply points, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The trucks carried an average of 12,000 tons of supplies per day, across 82 days of operation. Those numbers sound impressive until you learn that the trucks themselves consumed roughly 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just to keep running. The Express was eating its own tail. It burned enormous quantities of the very resource it was trying to deliver. The National Archives records and the Quartermaster Museum's petroleum history make this structural problem visible in a way that memoirs cannot. The Transportation Corps' own after-action analysis noted that Patton's Third Army and Courtney Hodges' First Army together required approximately 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day at the height of the pursuit phase. The pipeline from the beaches was not built for that demand. The pre-invasion logistical planning had assumed a more methodical advance, a step-by-step progression that Operation Cobra's success had completely invalidated. The planners had been too good at the slow part, and then were blindsided by how well the fast part worked. I spent some time trying to reconstruct the mood in Patton's headquarters during those last days of August, and what strikes me most isn't the frustration that comes through in his diary entries, though that frustration is real and vivid. It's the gap between what Patton wrote and what the supply ledgers show. Patton blamed SHAEF policy. He blamed Eisenhower. He blamed Montgomery. The ledgers suggest something more systemic. A logistical architecture that had simply never been designed to feed a pursuit of this speed across this distance. Nobody was the villain. The system was just outpacing itself. The historiographical debate here is genuine and has never been fully resolved. Martin van Creveld, in his 1977 study of supply and logistics in the Second World War, argued that the Allied logistical system in the summer of 1944 was always going to hit a wall somewhere east of Paris, regardless of how skillfully the operational commanders performed. John Keegan and other writers have pushed back, suggesting that different priority decisions in late August could have sustained the momentum longer. Both positions have merit. Both positions also ignore the 31,000 gallons. Because that number isn't an abstraction. That number is a specific decision, made by specific people on a specific day. And it stopped Patton as surely as any German panzer division. The Red Ball drivers themselves are a chapter in this story that the logistics ledgers can only partially capture. The route crews were overwhelmingly black soldiers. The Express was one of the most racially integrated operations the US Army conducted in the European theatre. Not out of principle, but out of necessity, because the Army needed drivers, and the Transportation Corps had black units available and trained. They drove without headlights at night to avoid German air attack. They drove on roads that were deteriorating under the traffic load. They drove trucks that were wearing out faster than they could be maintained. The National World War II Museum estimates the Express moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies over its 82 days of operation. That number was built one exhausted driver at a time. The conflict between the official record and the human experience here is worth sitting with. The Transportation Corps history and the after-action reports speak in aggregates: tonnage, gallons, daily averages. The individual accounts, the driver diaries, the unit histories, the medical records, speak in something else entirely. Drivers falling asleep at the wheel, trucks going off-road in the dark, men developing hand tremors from the constant vibration. The system worked, in the aggregate. It frequently failed the individuals inside it. Military history has a tendency to collapse those two scales into each other, and it shouldn't. By the first week of September, the fuel crisis had done what no German counteroffensive had managed to do. It had stopped the Allied advance across a broad front. Patton's Third Army sat immobile east of Paris. Hodge's First Army was barely moving. Montgomery's forces in the north were similarly constrained. The logistical historians call this the September crisis, and it's worth noting that it was entirely self-inflicted, at least in the sense that it resulted from Allied success, not Allied failure. They had advanced so fast, so far, that they'd outrun the supply chain they'd built. That's an unusual way to get stuck. But stuck is stuck, regardless of the reason. What the 31st of August fuel ledger really records, when you look at it honestly, is the moment when the arithmetic of industrial warfare reasserted itself over the ambitions of the men conducting it. 400,000 gallons to 31,000 gallons. That's not strategy, that's physics. The army that had broken through the bocage, encircled two German armies at Falaise, and liberated Paris in 52 days, ran out of fuel 6 miles from the German border. The enemy it hadn't caught, the divisions and headquarters and staffs that had slipped through the Falaise Gap, were already digging new defensive positions in the West Wall. And the fuel to close that final distance simply wasn't there. Chapter 14. On the 13th of August, 1944, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, a telephone call went from General Omar Bradley's headquarters to General Wade Hayslip's 15th Corps. The substance of that call was simple. Stop. Don't go beyond Argentan. Hold where you are. Hayslip's forces were within striking distance of closing the northern jaw of the Falaise Pocket. The Canadians were pushing down from the north. The gap between them was roughly 25 miles. And Bradley told his corps commander to halt. That phone call, documented in 1st Army Group operational records, and in Bradley's own memoir, A Soldier's Story, is one of the most argued over moments in the entire Normandy campaign. Historians have been fighting about it for more than 80 years, and they haven't stopped. Bradley's own explanation, given in his memoir and repeated in subsequent interviews, centered on two related concerns. First, he was operating near or across the Army Group boundary with Montgomery's 21st Army Group, and he was reluctant to push forces into territory that was nominally under British operational control without explicit permission from Montgomery. Second, he feared a head-on collision between American and Canadian forces in the confusion of a closing pocket, what he called a dangerous and uncontrollable maneuver. The memoir phrasing is careful, almost legal. I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise. Clean. Quotable. The kind of sentence that sounds like wisdom in retrospect. The contemporaneous records are more complicated. The 1st Army Group operational diary for 13th August contains a terse telephone notation that does not match the considered tone of Bradley's memoir. The diary entry records the halt order as given, but the surrounding entries show significant uncertainty about German strength, significant concern about the 15th Corps' exposed flanks, and this is the detail that the memoir softens. Explicit acknowledgement that delayed action bombs dropped by Allied aircraft were still fused and active in the area forward of Argentan, with some fuses set for up to 12 hours. The bombing had only ended hours earlier. The road forward was literally mined with unexploded Allied ordnance. The German strength estimates at that moment deserve careful examination, because Bradley's figure of 19 German divisions still capable of fighting has been extensively challenged by subsequent research. By the 13th of August, the 9th Panzer Division had been reduced to approximately 260 men and 12 operational tanks. The 1st SS Panzer Division had 352 men, 8 self-propelled guns, and 21 tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division was far below its earlier strength of 2,220 men. The divisions were still there, in the organizational sense. They had designations, they had officers, they had some equipment, but they were not divisions in any meaningful combat sense. Bradley's intelligence picture was significantly more pessimistic than the ground truth. This is the central historiographical friction of the Argentan halt. Whether Bradley was right to be cautious given what he knew at the time, or whether he was wrong given what was actually true. Max Hastings, in his analysis of the Normandy campaign, argued that the halt was a serious mistake that allowed tens of thousands of German soldiers to escape and fight again in the Ardennes, at the Siegfried Line, and in the Rhine crossings. Carlo D'Este's more sympathetic reading emphasized that operational commanders must make decisions based on available intelligence, not on intelligence that will only be compiled and analyzed months later by historians with access to all sides of the record. Both positions are defensible. Neither is comfortable. The Falaise Gap itself, that 25-mile opening between the American positions at Argentan and the Canadian positions advancing toward Falaise, is one of the most discussed terrain features in the literature of the Normandy campaign. It was not a clean gap. It was contested ground, under air attack, heavily mined with both Allied and German ordnance, and traversed by roads that were simultaneously being used by retreating German columns and advancing Allied units. The decision to close it physically, with ground forces meeting in the middle, carried real risks of fratricide, supply disruption, and command confusion. Bradley's fears were not irrational, but the gap stayed open for 5 days after the halt order. 5 days. I keep returning to the Canadian side of this equation, because the narrative has a tendency to focus on Bradley and Patton at the expense of what was happening on the other jaw of the trap. The Canadian First Army, under General Henry Crerar, launched Operation Tractable on the 14th of August, the day after Bradley's halt, with 800 heavy bombers dropping 3,700 tons of bombs in a concentrated carpet bombing attack on the German positions south of Falaise. The operation was intended to drive Canadian and Polish forces to within 3 miles of Falaise itself. It largely succeeded in its objectives. It also inflicted approximately 400 casualties on Canadian and Polish units through friendly fire, repeating the terrible pattern established at Saint-Lô 3 weeks earlier. The northern jaw was grinding closed, but it was grinding. The command friction between Bradley, Montgomery, and Eisenhower during these days is documented in their respective headquarters diaries and in the subsequent memoirs, and the 3 accounts don't entirely align. Eisenhower's crusade in Europe presents a picture of coordinated decision-making. Bradley's memoir presents a picture of a commander exercising appropriate caution within his assigned operational zone. Montgomery's subsequent accounts suggest frustration with the pace of American decision-making. The operational diaries, the contemporaneous records, not the polished retrospective accounts, show something messier. a command structure operating at the edge of its coordination capacity, with significant communication delays and genuine uncertainty about what was happening on the ground. The estimates of German soldiers who escaped through the Falaise Gap range from 20,000 to 50,000, depending on the source and the methodology. The Wikipedia summary, drawing on multiple secondary sources, suggests approximately 80,000 to 100,000 Germans were trapped in the pocket, with 10,000 to 15,000 killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, and 20,000 to 50,000 escaped. The Imperial War Museum's estimate of roughly 50,000 escaped aligns with the higher end of that range. Those escaped soldiers included senior headquarters staffs, experienced panzer crews, and veteran infantry officers, the organizational skeleton of an army that would form the core of the German defensive effort in the autumn and winter of 1944. The halt order of the 13th of August was not the only decision that shaped the pocket's outcome, but it was the most consequential single decision, and it was made by one man, on one morning, on the basis of intelligence that was partially wrong and concerns that were partially justified. That's how operational history actually works. Not in clean narratives of success and failure, but in the specific gravity of specific moments, made by specific people with incomplete information, under pressure, with bombs still ticking in the fields ahead of them. Bradley's solid shoulder became the gap through which the German army bled out. Slowly, partially, not completely. History tends to remember the gap. He preferred to remember the shoulder. Chapter 15. There is a passage in the Army Group B War Diary, the Kriegstagebuch, held in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, that records, in the clipped bureaucratic language of German military administration, the fuel situation for the units committed to Operation Lüttich on the 7th of August, 1944. The entry notes that the fuel allocation for the attacking panzer divisions was insufficient to sustain the operation beyond the first 48 hours at projected consumption rates. The operation was designed to drive 40 miles west to Avranches, sever the Allied supply corridor, and reverse the entire strategic situation in Normandy. The fuel available would support approximately 2 days of offensive movement. These two facts were recorded in the same document, by the same staff officers, without apparent irony. Hitler's order for Operation Lüttich arrived at Army Group B headquarters in the first days of August with the urgency that characterized all of his late-war operational directives. Patton's Third Army had broken through at Avranches on the 1st of August. The German line in Normandy had not merely bent, it had dissolved. Hitler's response was characteristically grandiose and characteristically disconnected from the logistical reality that the Bundesarchiv diary was quietly recording. Concentrate the available panzer forces, strike west to the coast, cut off Patton's supply lines, and restore the front. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, understood that the order was operationally impossible. He executed it anyway. The ultra-intelligence picture adds a layer to this story that the Bundesarchiv diary cannot provide, and the historiographical debate about what the Allies actually knew, and when they knew it, is genuinely unresolved. Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won asserts that Ultra gave advance warning of the Mortain attack. The US Air Force historical series, D-Day 1944, Air Power over the Normandy beaches and beyond, challenges this, noting that the critical Ultra message arrived at midnight on the 6th of August, just before the German assault began, far too late for any meaningful redeployment of forces. British Intelligence in the Second World War, Volume 3, Part 2, records emergency signals at 2001, 2140, and 011 on the 7th of August, confirming that the intelligence arrived in fragments in the hours immediately before the attack. The warning was real, the lead time was not. What stopped Operation Lüttich was not foreknowledge. What stopped it was the 39th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, dug in on Hill 314 above Mortain, refusing to move. The Warfare History Network's account of the hill defense notes that at 38 minutes past midnight on the 7th of August, the 30th Division reported a possible enemy counterattack within 12 hours. That report was accurate. By dawn, German forces from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and elements of the 1st SS Leibstandarte were pressing against the American positions from multiple directions. The 690 men on Hill 314, the number comes from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion history, were surrounded within hours. The defense of Hill 314 is one of those episodes that military historians have tended to present as a story of individual heroism, and it was that, genuinely and completely. But it was also a story about fire control, about the specific technical relationship between forward observers and artillery batteries, and about the peculiar mathematics of a surrounded force that can still call for fires. Lieutenant Robert Weiss and the forward observer teams on the hill made 192 artillery fire mission calls over 6 days. RAF Typhoons flew 429 sorties against German armour in the valley below, firing more than 2,000 rockets. The German panzer columns that Hitler's order required to reach Avranches by the evening of the 8th of August were stopped, burned, and countered. The Warfare History Network's analysis of the battle records approximately 70 German tanks destroyed or captured in the Mortain area, roughly 40 of them destroyed outright. The German army that hit Mortain on the 7th of August was not the German army of 1941. The Bundesarchiv diary records this plainly. The divisions committed to Lüttich were at fractions of their authorized strength. The combat power that Hitler's order assumed simply wasn't there. The order was written in the grammar of a military force that no longer existed. The 9th Panzer Division had 12 operational tanks. The 1st SS Panzer had 21. These were not armoured divisions in any operational sense. They were armoured designations wrapped around infantry remnants and a handful of functioning vehicles. And Hitler was ordering them to drive 40 miles through territory controlled by an enemy with air superiority, artillery superiority, and a functioning intelligence network. Kluge's position during these days was almost geometrically impossible. He was commanding an army group that was being destroyed from without by Allied air power and ground forces, and being paralyzed from within by an OKW that was issuing operational directives without any apparent connection to the material reality his staff was recording in the Kriegstagebuch. He was also, by August of 1944, a man under political suspicion. The July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had implicated a wide circle of senior officers. Kluge had been approached by the conspirators and had declined to participate, but the connection existed, and he knew that it was known. His headquarters staff was aware that the SD, the security service, was watching. On the 19th of August, Kluge disappeared for a full day. He was out of communication with OKW, with Army Group B headquarters, and with the frontline commanders who desperately needed direction as the Falaise Pocket was closing around them. The Bundesarchiv records and subsequent accounts suggest he spent part of that day near Falaise, possibly attempting to assess the situation personally, possibly attempting to negotiate a local surrender that Hitler would never have sanctioned, possibly simply overwhelmed. Hitler, receiving reports of the communication blackout, concluded that Kluge was attempting to negotiate with the Allies. He was relieved of command that evening and ordered to report to Berlin. Kluge understood what reporting to Berlin meant. He was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most reliable crisis commanders, a man whose energy and tactical flexibility had repeatedly stabilized collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front. Model arrived in Normandy to find an army group that was already, in operational terms, finished. The Falaise Pocket was closing. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were being destroyed inside it. There was no front to stabilize because the front had ceased to exist in any coherent sense. Model's first reports to OKW, quoted in subsequent German historical accounts, were essentially lucid descriptions of catastrophe. Kluge wrote his letter to Hitler in the back of a staff car, somewhere between Metz and the German border, on the 19th of August, 1944. The Spartacus educational summary of his last days, drawing on contemporary German records, notes that the letter warned Hitler that the war in the West was lost and urged him to consider ending it. Then Kluge swallowed cyanide. He was 62 years old. He had commanded German forces in France, in Russia, and in France again. He had obeyed orders that he knew to be militarily wrong, because obedience had been, for his entire career, the operating system of his professional life. The letter was his one act of clarity. Nobody in Berlin read it with the attention it deserved. Chapter 16. 52 Days. From the 25th of July, 1944, to the 25th of August, the liberation of Paris. The Allied forces in Normandy transformed from a force grinding itself apart in the bocage into a force standing in the streets of a capital city. 52 days. When I first started working through the oral histories at the Eisenhower Center, what struck me most wasn't the tactical detail or the operational analysis. It was the texture of time. How those 52 days felt completely different to the people who lived through them, depending on where they stood, what they carried, and what they'd already survived. The soldier who spent the first 3 weeks of that 52-day period in a hedgerow outside Saint-Lô, crawling forward 20 yards in a day, watching the man next to him disappear in a burst of machine gun fire, eating cold rations in a ditch that smelled of cordite and something worse, experienced a different 52 days than the armored crewman who roared through the Avranches gap on the 2nd of August and didn't stop moving for 3 weeks. The operational historian's 52 days, the arc from Cobra's planning to Paris's liberation, clean and purposeful in retrospect, is an abstraction built on top of 52 days of specific, individual, irrecoverable experience. The Eisenhower Center oral histories keep this gap visible in a way that operational maps cannot. The liberation of Paris on the 25th of August deserves its own examination, because the decision to liberate it at all was not inevitable. Eisenhower's original operational plan had called for bypassing Paris, going around it, leaving it to fall later when the logistical situation was more favorable and the German garrison had been isolated. Paris consumed resources, food, fuel, medical supplies, administrative capacity. A liberated Paris full of civilians would require everything that Eisenhower's armies needed for themselves. The decision to send General Philippe Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division into the city on the 22nd of August, a decision driven as much by French political pressure and the reality of the Paris uprising as by any operational calculation, was a deviation from the plan. It was the right deviation. The Eisenhower Center oral testimonies from veterans of the final approach to Paris contain a recurring quality that the operational records can't replicate: the strangeness of arrival. Men who had spent weeks in the mud and blood of the bocage found themselves, in the space of a few days, driving through cheering crowds on tree-lined boulevards. The cognitive distance between those two experiences, between the hedgerow and the boulevard, was real and was widely noted by the men who lived it. Some of the oral testimonies record not triumph, but a kind of disorientation, a difficulty connecting the person who had been in the ditch with the person now being handed flowers by a French woman in a summer dress. The German garrison in Paris, roughly 17,000 men under General Dietrich von Holtitz, did not fight to the last building as Hitler had ordered. Holtitz had received explicit instructions to destroy the city's bridges, flood the Seine, and demolish the major monuments before surrendering. He did not carry out those orders. The reasons he gave after the war in his memoir Soldat unter Soldaten attribute his decision to a recognition that the destruction would serve no military purpose and that history would hold him accountable for the city's fate. Historians have debated the extent to which his memoir accurately represents his reasoning at the time. What's not debated is that the city survived intact. The bridges were not destroyed. The Eiffel Tower was not demolished. The Louvre was not burned. The contrast between what happened in Paris and what happened in Warsaw, where German forces carried out systematic destruction of the city following the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, is one of the most disturbing juxtapositions of the summer of 1944. Both cities had German garrisons. Both had orders for destruction. One city survived. One did not. The difference was not Allied military power or diplomatic skill. The difference was Choltitz's individual decision, made in a specific office on a specific night, with a specific set of calculations about his own future and the city's fate. Military history, which prefers structural explanations and systemic analysis, sometimes struggles with the weight of individual choice. This is one of those cases where the individual choice was everything. The 52 days produced numbers that demand to be placed alongside each other, because the juxtaposition is the story. Allied total casualties from D-Day through the end of July were approximately 180,000, a figure from the operational records that encompasses killed, wounded, and missing across the entire Allied force. German losses through the 14th of August, per the records cited in the Abiblio Hyperwar series, were approximately 151,000 enlisted men, 3,630 officers, and 3,800 Osttruppen, roughly 160,000 total, against only 30,000 German replacements arriving during the same period. The German army was bleeding out faster than it could be replaced. The Allied army was doing the same. Both sides were consuming themselves. The difference was that the Allies had the deeper pool. The oral histories register something that the casualty tables cannot: the exhaustion of the men who survived those 52 days. The Eisenhower Center testimonies include accounts from infantry veterans who describe a specific quality of tiredness that goes beyond physical fatigue. A kind of perceptual narrowing, a reduction of the horizon to the next few hours, the next field, the next hedgerow. Unit cohesion studies from the period show that divisions that had been in continuous contact since D-Day were operating with replacement percentages that effectively made them different units from the ones that had landed in June. The experienced junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the people who actually made the tactical decisions that kept units functional, were being replaced at rates that the training pipeline in England could barely sustain. The logistical dimension of the 52 days comes back, as it always does, to the Red Ball Express and the fuel crisis. The liberation of Paris on the 25th of August was not the end of the campaign. It was the moment when the campaign's logistical contradictions became unavoidable. The armies that drove into Paris were already running low on the supplies needed to continue east. The strategic opportunity created by Cobra and the Falaise Encirclement, the open country east of Paris, the disorganized German army, the possibility of reaching the Rhine before winter, was contingent on a logistical system that was already approaching its limits. The 52 days of triumph were followed by a logistical halt that gave the German army time it should not have had. The gap between what the 52 days could have meant and what they actually produced is where the historiographical debate lives. If the Falaise gap had been closed more firmly, If Bradley's halt order had not been given, or if it had been given a day later, or if the Canadians had pushed harder on the northern jaw, would the German army in the west have been so thoroughly destroyed that the autumn campaigns would have been unnecessary? Some historians, including John Keegan, have suggested this possibility. Others, including Martin van Creveld, have argued that the logistical wall would have stopped the Allied advance in September, regardless of what happened at Falaise. The debate is unresolved. What's certain is that 52 days changed the shape of the war in a way that nothing before it had, and that the men who made it possible, the truck drivers on the Red Ball, the forward observers on Hill 314, the infantrymen in the hedgerows, experienced it 1 hour at a time, one hedgerow at a time, in conditions that no operational summary can adequately capture. Chapter 17. In 1945, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder testified before a British parliamentary inquiry into Allied air operations in the European theatre, and he said something that has been quoted selectively ever since. The passage in question concerned the carpet bombing operations of the Normandy campaign, the July 25th Cobra strike, the Operation Tractable bombing on August 14th, and Tedder's acknowledgement that the margin of safety between Allied bombers and Allied ground troops was, in his words, uncomfortably narrow. The official account of his testimony, preserved in the parliamentary records, presents this as a technical observation about bombing accuracy. The soldier accounts, the after-action reports of the 30th Infantry Division, the testimony of survivors from the 19th Corps units hit on July 24th, presented as something else entirely. They presented as an understatement. The official story of Operation Cobra, as it crystallized in the US Army official history and in the memoir literature of the major commanders, is a story of a complex operation that achieved its objectives despite significant friction. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. Cobra did achieve its objectives. The breakout was real. The exploitation was genuine. The German army in Normandy was decisively defeated. But despite significant friction, is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And the friction in question killed 111 American soldiers on July 25th alone, wounded 490 more, and produced 164 cases of acute combat stress, severe enough to require medical evacuation. The friction had names. The friction had families. The friction is buried in American cemeteries in Normandy. The historiographical trajectory of Operation Cobra, from the immediate post-war period to the present, follows a pattern that military historians have documented in other major operations. Initial celebration, followed by critical re-examination, followed by a more nuanced synthesis that acknowledges both achievement and cost. The immediate post-war accounts, shaped by the relief of victory and the natural desire to find coherent narrative in chaos, tended to emphasize the triumph of the breakout and the brilliance of the planning. The critical re-examination, beginning with serious scholarship in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 90s, raised harder questions. Why was the bomb run perpendicular to the front line when Bradley had explicitly requested parallel? Why did the halt order at Argentan remain in place for 5 days? Why were the logistical implications of a rapid pursuit not planned for more carefully? The perpendicular bombing run is worth dwelling on because it illustrates a structural problem that went beyond any individual's error. Bradley had been unambiguous in his request to 8th Air Force. The bombers should approach along the axis of the road from Periers to Saint-Lô, parallel to the front line, so that any bombs that fell short would land in German territory rather than on American troops. The Air Force agreed. Then the Air Force planners, working within their own operational parameters and their own understanding of acceptable risk, planned the run perpendicular to the front line instead. The Wavell Room analysis of Cobra's air-land integration, drawing on primary source footnotes including John Sullivan's The Botched Air Support of Operation Cobra, is precise about this. The decision to fly perpendicular was made by air planners who believed it was tactically sound and who did not fully internalize Bradley's safety requirements. The result was geometrically inevitable. Short bombs fell on American positions. The broader problem revealed by this failure, the structural difficulty of integrating strategic air assets into tactical ground operations, was not new in July of 1944. The Air Corps Tactical School had been wrestling with questions of air-land integration since the 1930s. Operation Goodwood, the British armoured offensive in mid-July, had used massive strategic bombing in a tactical support role with mixed results. The Wavell Room analysis places Cobra within a longer doctrinal argument about whether strategic bombers could or should be used in direct support of ground forces. And the answer that Cobra provided was, yes, they can, and no, they shouldn't be expected to achieve the precision that ground commanders assume they will achieve. The capabilities and the expectations were not aligned, and the gap between them was measured in American casualties. The forward air controller problem, the absence of adequate radio equipment and communication protocols to allow ground units to redirect air assets in real time, was identified as a significant failure during and after Cobra. The SCR-399 radio, the system with sufficient range and capability to maintain reliable communication between forward ground observers and aircraft, had been left behind during the rapid advance. Units were relying on the SCR-284, which had insufficient range for effective air-ground coordination over the distances involved. The Wavell Room essay notes that the Horsefly L5 liaison aircraft, which emerged from the Cobra experience as an improvised forward air controller platform, represented a doctrinal adaptation driven by operational failure. The Army didn't have a good solution to the air-ground communication problem before Cobra. Cobra demonstrated why that was a problem. The solution was developed partly during and partly after the battle. Tedder's 1945 testimony also touched on the question of command unity, or rather, the lack of it. The Allied air command structure in the European theatre was not a unified structure. It was a committee. Tedder served as Eisenhower's deputy and as the de facto coordinator of Allied air power, but the actual command lines ran separately to Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory at Allied Expeditionary Air Forces, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris at Bomber Command, and General Carl Spaatz at U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. These four men had different institutional priorities, different operational philosophies, and different relationships with the ground commanders. The fragmentation that produced the perpendicular bombing run at Cobra was not an accident. It was a structural feature of a command architecture that had been designed by committee and never fully rationalized. The soldier testimonies about Cobra, the after-action reports, the unit histories, the oral accounts collected in the years after the war, contain a quality that Tedder's parliamentary testimony and the official histories lack, which is the specific texture of what it felt like to be bombed by your own air force while you were trying to fight the enemies. The 30th Infantry Division's after-action report, covering both the 24th and 25th of July, records the confusion in precise military language. Units pulling back from the bomb line before the attack, units advancing after the attack, units caught in the middle when the bombers came in on the wrong axis. The language is official, controlled, institutional. But underneath the controlled language, if you've spent enough time with this material, you can hear something else. The disbelief, the rage, the particular horror of dying from your own side's weapons while the enemy watches. There is something almost unbearable about the McNair story, and I find myself returning to it more than I expected when I first encountered it in the research. General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, was in a foxhole near Saint-Lô on the 25th of July, watching the Cobra bombing, ostensibly as part of his cover role in the Fusag deception operation. His presence was, in operational terms, a deception asset. McNair's apparent involvement with First Army Group forces was meant to convince German intelligence that the main Allied blow was still coming at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. A bomb landed on his position, and his body was thrown 80 feet. His death was kept from the press for weeks to protect the deception. He was buried quietly, in secret, while his public role in Fusag continued to be maintained in the Allied deception architecture. The official story and the human story diverged completely, as they do in wartime, and the gap between them is the size of a man's life. What Operation Cobra ultimately became, in the 80-plus years since it was fought, is a reference point for a set of arguments that were already old in 1944 and haven't been resolved since. How do you integrate air power and ground power at the tactical level without sacrificing the strategic coherence of either? How do you balance operational speed against logistical sustainability in a pursuit operation? How do you manage command relationships between national armies with different institutional cultures and different operational doctrines? Cobra's answers to these questions were messy, expensive, and partial. They were also, in the end, sufficient. The German army in the West was defeated. Paris was liberated. The war in Europe was, by August of 1944, a matter of time and cost rather than outcome. The cost matters. 111 Americans killed by their own bombers on July 25th. Approximately 180,000 Allied casualties from D-Day through the end of July. 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed in the Falaise Pocket. 20,000 to 50,000 Germans escaped through the gap. Soldiers who would fight again at the Bulge, at the Siegfried Line, along the Rhine. The Red Ball Express burned itself out, delivering supplies that still weren't enough to sustain the pursuit. Field Marshal von Kluge swallowed poison in the back of a car on a French road. And somewhere in Normandy, in one of the cemeteries that the American Battle Monuments Commission maintains with such careful, quiet dignity, there are graves of men who were killed by the bombs of their own air force, on a day that military history records as a success. The margin of safety that Tedder mentioned in his testimony was not, for those men, a margin at all. It was the distance between a targeting error and a grave. I think about that distance more than the official record wants me to.